Hey there, welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we step into the world of Paul Castellano. Some knew him as Big Paul, others the Howard Hughes of the Mafia. But in the end, the world remembered him as the White House Don, a man who built his empire in boardrooms instead of back alleys, only to be cut down in a storm of bullets outside Sparks Steakhouse. It's a story of power, betrayal, and a cold December night in New York that changed the Mafia forever. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it for you? It's always surreal watching this little underworld of ours stretch across time zones and continents. And hey, if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We've got more shadows to explore, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. All right, settle in. Let the noise of the day slip away, and follow me into the shadows. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn, under the bright holiday lights of Manhattan. In December of 1985, a man in an expensive overcoat stepped out of a car in front of Sparks Steakhouse. He was older now, carrying the weight of wealth, years, and the invisible crown of the Gambino crime family. He thought he was headed inside for dinner. Instead, he was walking into history. Bullets tore through the air, glass shattered, and in a matter of seconds Paul Castellano lay dying on the cold pavement, his life's empire collapsing with him. But to understand how this man became the White House Don, you have to go back, long before the fancy suits, before the mansion on Staten Island, before his name commanded both fear and envy. You have to return to the streets of Brooklyn in the 19-teens, where the children of Sicilian immigrants tried to carve out a life in a world that did not welcome them. Costantino Castellano, who the world would later call Paul, was born in 1915 to Giuseppe and Concetta Castellano. They were immigrants from Sicily, part of the endless wave of families who crossed the Atlantic with hope in their hearts and very little in their pockets. The streets of Brooklyn were crowded with people just like them, Italians, Irish, Jews, all crammed into row houses and tenement apartments, competing for scraps of work and respect. For young Paul, life was not painted in bright colors. It was a grind of early mornings, butcher paper, and the sound of knives against bone. His father was a butcher, and Paul was expected to learn the trade. The shop was small, cramped, always carrying the sharp iron smell of blood. Customers came and went, women in shawls, men in work boots, children clutching coins tight in their fists. School never came easily to him. By 8th grade, he had dropped out, convinced that a classroom could not teach him the lessons he really needed. The streets were his teacher, and his father's butcher shop was his training ground. He learned how to handle meat with precision, how to look a man in the eye and size him up, and, most importantly, how to stay quiet when it was better not to speak. In those years, silence was currency. Immigrant families lived by it. You did not ask too many questions, especially about the men who gathered in the back of cafes or walked the neighborhood with expensive shoes and no clear job. You nodded politely. You kept your head down. You learned that survival depended on knowing when to blend in and when to stand out. Paul absorbed it all. He had the heavy build of a butcher, broad shoulders and thick arms, but his eyes gave away something sharper. He watched everything, listened to every whisper. When the older men in the neighborhood spoke Sicilian in low voices, discussing business, Paul leaned in without seeming to. He was a student of power before he ever held it. His first brushes with crime were small, almost forgettable in the bigger story. A stolen chicken here, a pocketed coin there. Petty things that boys in the neighborhood did to feel a taste of control in a city that never gave them much. But in those petty crimes was a seed, a willingness to step outside the lines, to see rules not as barriers but as suggestions. One night, Paul and a cousin were caught stealing from a delivery truck. The police, tired of dealing with Italian kids who never seemed to learn, roughed them up and threw them in the back of a patrol car. For Paul, that cold metal seat was a moment of reckoning. The fear was real, yes, but so was the thrill. He felt the pulse of danger, and something inside him didn't shrink away. It leaned forward. The older he got, the more he noticed the men who didn't carry butcher knives or construction tools, but still seemed to command respect. They had clean suits, shiny shoes, and people stepped aside for them. Some were related to him by blood, others by neighborhood. And there was one man in particular who cast a long shadow over Paul's future, Carlo Gambino. Carlo was married to Paul's sister, making him family not just in the Sicilian sense, but in the blood sense too. At family gatherings, Paul watched Carlo carefully. Carlo was quiet, polite, almost humble in manner, but everyone deferred to him. His presence was subtle but absolute, like gravity. Paul recognized it instantly. This was a man who controlled things without ever needing to raise his voice. In the 1920s and 30s, Brooklyn was a breeding ground for the Mafia's next generation. Prohibition had turned gangs into empires, and the Italian Mafia was staking its claim across New York. Bootlegging, numbers games, loan sharking, they were rivers of cash, and those who controlled them lived like kings. Paul wasn't a street brawler by nature. He preferred calculation to chaos, money to mayhem. But in those years, it didn't matter what kind of man you thought you were. Sooner or later, the Mafia reached into your life. And for Paul Castellano, it wasn't just a choice. It was destiny, sealed by family ties and the world he was born into. Still, the butcher's apron stayed with him longer than most expected. He worked in his father's shop, learning discipline and patience. Cutting meat required precision, and Paul carried that same careful precision into everything he did. The way he thought about money, the way he thought about loyalty, it was all about knowing where to cut and where to leave the flesh intact. Neighbors remembered him as serious, not one to waste words. He was never the loudest boy on the block, never the one to throw the first punch. But he was always watching, always calculating. Even as a teenager, there was something about him that suggested he was aiming higher, beyond the small shops and crowded tenements. Brooklyn in the 30s was not forgiving. Jobs were scarce. The Depression left families scrambling to put bread on the table. For immigrant kids, the path forward was narrow. You either worked yourself to the bone in factories or shops, or you found another way. That other way often meant crime. And for Paul, whose family ties already placed him close to men of power, crime was less a temptation and more an invitation. Every choice he made seemed to pull him closer, helping his cousins with small schemes, running errands for men who slipped him extra bills, standing guard outside a backroom meeting. He played the part of the butcher's son, but beneath it all, he was being groomed for something larger. His parents, like many Sicilian immigrants, held traditional values. Work hard, provide for your family, stay loyal. But those values, twisted through the lens of organized crime, became the very foundation of Mafia life. Hard work turned into running rackets. Providing for family meant building an empire. Loyalty became omerta, the code of silence. By the late 1930s, Paul Castellano was no longer just the butcher's son. He was known, quietly, as someone who could be trusted, someone who could keep his mouth shut, someone who was ready for more. And in a world where silence was worth more than gold, that made him valuable. Still, Paul carried the weight of expectation. He had seen enough men rise and fall to understand the stakes. Every decision, every handshake, every whispered promise had consequences. And while he was not yet the man who would one day sit at the head of the Gambino family, the foundation had been laid. What haunted him, and perhaps thrilled him, was the awareness that he was standing at a crossroads. He could remain the butcher, safe, simple, forgettable, or he could step into the shadows with the men who wore suits instead of aprons, who carried influence instead of knives. That choice was no longer abstract. It was approaching quickly, like a train barreling down the tracks. And Paul knew, deep inside, that once he stepped aboard, there would be no turning back. The boy from the butcher shop was about to disappear, replaced by something far more dangerous. But before that transformation was complete, Paul would need to prove himself. And proving yourself in the Mafia was never clean, never simple. It was a test written in loyalty and blood. And in the next chapter of his life, the butcher's son would take his first true steps into that shadow world, where every cut carried a price, and every silence was a currency of power. Because in Brooklyn, in those years, boys did not simply grow into men. They grew into soldiers. and Paul Castellano was about to discover what kind of soldier he was destined to be. On a cold night years before Paul Castellano's name would echo in Mafia history, a wedding feast in Brooklyn lit up a neighborhood otherwise dulled by poverty and grit. Laughter, clinking glasses, and Sicilian songs spilled out into the streets, and for those gathered inside, it was more than a marriage. It was the quiet weaving of bloodlines into the fabric of power. Paul's sister had just married a man whose presence was unremarkable to outsiders, but magnetic to anyone who knew the underworld. His name was Carlo Gambino, and though few could have guessed it then, that union would set Paul Castellano's destiny on a collision course with both fortune and fatality. Carlo was not like the loud gangsters Paul sometimes spotted leaning on corners or swaggering through clubs. He didn't flaunt himself with flashy jewelry or raise his voice to make a point. If anything, he blended in, soft-spoken and deliberate. But power radiated from him in ways subtle and undeniable. He was like the tide, quiet, steady, but capable of pulling everything toward him without effort. Paul, still a young man at the time, watched closely. He had grown up in the butcher's shop, where meat was measured in pounds and customers bargained with every cent. Now, here was a man who dealt not in pennies or scraps, but in influence itself. The way men leaned in when Carlo spoke, the way they lowered their eyes when he looked their way, it was a lesson without words. Respect, Paul realized, wasn't shouted. It was commanded. At family gatherings, Paul kept his ears open and his mouth shut. The conversations often drifted into politics of the street, whispered references to men with nicknames, debts being collected, favors being exchanged. Most relatives pretended not to notice, but Paul noticed everything. He began to see the outlines of a world layered beneath the visible one, like a shadow cast by a building at sunset, hidden but always present. Brooklyn in the 1930s was teeming with those shadows. Italian immigrants clustered together, clinging to familiar dialects and traditions, but just as often clashing over scraps of territory and pride. Prohibition had filled the coffers of men who knew how to move liquor, gamble, and loan money at brutal interest. By the time it ended, those men weren't fading away. They were evolving. And at the center of this evolution stood figures like Carlo Gambino, men who could orchestrate violence when needed but preferred to build empires quietly, brick by brick, handshake by handshake. Paul was pulled in, not by formal invitations, but by proximity and blood. When your sister married into that kind of world, you didn't stay a butcher forever. Slowly, the favors started. A request to deliver an envelope, a suggestion to sit in on a meeting, a chance to stand beside Carlo at a table and absorb the rhythm of deals being made. They were small tasks, almost trivial on the surface, but every one of them carried weight. Each one tested whether Paul understood the rules, loyalty above all, silence without question. Carlo, for his part, took notice of his brother-in-law. Paul wasn't brash. He wasn't reckless. He carried himself with the same patience he had learned slicing meat with precision. Carlo liked that. Reckless men burned out quickly in their world. Patient men endured. The bond between them deepened not in fiery bursts but in slow, calculated steps. Carlo began entrusting Paul with more responsibility. Not just errands, but opportunities to handle money, to oversee small operations, to demonstrate judgment. For Paul, it was like learning a new trade. Only this one didn't involve knives and customers, but numbers, unions, and the quiet enforcement of promises. He studied Carlo with the eye of an apprentice. How he spoke gently but firmly. How he built alliances not through threats, but through favors that demanded repayment later. It was like watching a chess player who thought not about the next move, but about the 10th. Paul found himself drawn to this style. He was never a man who craved fistfights or bloodshed. He craved control, the steady rise that came from playing the long game. But with every step closer, Paul also felt the stakes grow heavier. This wasn't just about money. It was about belonging to something larger than himself, a network of men bound not by law but by silence and loyalty. Once inside, there was no leaving. The Mafia wasn't a business you retired from. It was more like a religion, demanding faith, sacrifice, and complete obedience. By the late 1930s, Paul's path was shifting. He still helped in the butcher shop, still wore the apron when needed, but he carried himself differently. Neighbors noticed that he no longer seemed like just another immigrant's son. He was connected, and in Brooklyn, being connected was everything. It meant protection. It meant doors opening. It meant power, even if you didn't flaunt it. Yet, being connected also meant danger. Paul had already seen the bruises on men who crossed the wrong line, the sudden disappearances of those who broke rules too sacred to be spoken aloud. He knew that in stepping further into Carlo's orbit, he was also stepping closer to that danger. It was a paradox that defined organized crime. The same ties that gave you strength could one day strangle you. What drew Paul deeper wasn't just ambition. It was also family. In Sicilian culture, family was more than blood, it was destiny. To honor his sister's marriage, to support Carlo, was to honor his own heritage. To turn away would have been unthinkable. So Paul leaned in, willingly, almost inevitably. One memory stayed with him, a night when he and Carlo walked together down a Brooklyn street after a family dinner. Carlo spoke softly, pointing out a row of buildings. "Every one of these belongs to somebody," he said. "Not the names on the deed. The real owners. The ones you never see." Paul nodded, and in that moment, something clicked. The world wasn't what it appeared. Ownership, power, control, they lived in shadows, hidden behind faces that looked ordinary. It was a lesson Paul never forgot. But even as he absorbed Carlo's wisdom, he also began to see cracks in the world around them. Rival gangs fought for control of neighborhoods. Violence simmered beneath the surface, always threatening to boil over. The newspapers printed stories of raids, shootings, and trials, but for every gangster who fell, another rose to take his place. It was a cycle, endless and merciless. And now Paul was part of it. He carried himself with caution, but ambition flickered inside him. If Carlo could rise, why not him? He wasn't the loudest, but he was steady, thoughtful, deliberate. The kind of man who could sit at the table and make decisions that shaped more than one neighborhood. Still, Paul was young, and the road ahead was uncertain. He was gaining trust, but trust in the Mafia was never absolute. One mistake could erase everything. One careless word could invite suspicion. And suspicion was a death sentence. As the 1930s gave way to the 40s, the world outside was changing. War loomed overseas. The streets of New York pulsed with both fear and opportunity. And within that shifting landscape, Paul Castellano was beginning to step out of the butcher's shadow and into something far larger. The question that lingered, quietly but relentlessly, was how far he was willing to go. How much of himself he was willing to trade for power. Because once you crossed a certain line in Carlo Gambino's world, there was no turning back. And for Paul Castellano, that line was fast approaching. The point where family ties would no longer just guide him, but bind him to a destiny that could never be undone. The smell of raw meat clung to his clothes, but Paul Castellano was no longer just a butcher's son. By the early 1940s, whispers had already begun to trail behind him through Brooklyn streets. Men in dark suits nodded in his direction. Neighbors spoke his name in lowered tones, and his presence inside certain cafes was no longer casual. Something had shifted. He had stepped quietly, almost invisibly, into the world of the Mafia. And once inside, there was no way back. The moment that sealed it didn't look like a ceremony, not the way people imagine. No candles, no oaths spoken in grand halls. Instead, it was a conversation in a dimly lit backroom, a simple exchange of trust between men who understood that their lives were now tied together. Paul, still young but carrying himself with the patience of someone older, had proven he could be relied on. He didn't talk out of turn. He didn't lose his temper. He followed orders and delivered. That was enough to open the first real door. He had been folded into the Mangano crime family, one of the original 5 families of New York. The Manganos controlled Brooklyn's waterfront, extorting longshoremen and pulling the strings behind unions that moved goods through the city's ports. For Paul, it was like stepping into a new butcher shop, only this one didn't trade in cuts of beef but in fear, favors, and protection. Extortion, the lifeblood of the family, was simple in concept but devastating in execution. A store owner paid for protection, not from random criminals, but from the very men offering the deal. Refuse, and your windows shattered, your shipments vanished, your workers were harassed until you broke. Pay, and everything flowed smoothly. It was like insurance, except the Mafia wrote the policy and collected the premium. Paul understood it instinctively. He had seen the same look on customers' faces back in the butcher shop, that uneasy calculation of what they could afford to lose versus what they couldn't risk losing. Fear was a currency, and Paul was learning to count it. He kept the butcher shop running, at least on the surface. It gave him cover, something respectable for neighbors to point to. But behind the counter, alongside the cuts of meat, money quietly passed through. Payments from shopkeepers, collections from trucks making deliveries, envelopes filled with cash. To outsiders, it was still the same neighborhood butcher. To those who knew, it was a front, a mask for the man who was no longer just Paul the butcher, but Paul the earner. The men above him noticed. In the Mafia, money was loyalty made tangible. If you earned, you were valuable. If you didn't, you were a liability. Paul earned, and he did it without drawing attention. Where others used fists and threats loudly, Paul leaned on quiet pressure, the kind that left a man unsettled but not humiliated. He believed fear worked best when it didn't need to shout. Yet, the work was not without moments that gnawed at him. One evening, a baker who had refused payments was dragged into an alley. Paul stood nearby, not giving the order but watching it unfold. The man's cries echoed off the brick, his apron smeared with flour and blood. Paul felt the weight of it in his chest. But he also saw the lesson. By morning, the baker's payments flowed in on time. Business, Paul realized, was not about cruelty for its own sake. It was about order, enforced by pain when necessary. Still, something about him set him apart from the typical soldier. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't eager to spill blood. He wanted efficiency, results. The higher-ups in the Mangano family respected that. Carlo Gambino, already maneuvering his way into greater power, saw even more. He knew his brother-in-law wasn't just muscle. He had the mind of a businessman. Paul studied the structure of the family with fascination. At the top sat the boss, then the underboss, then the consigliere, an advisor. Below them were capos, captains who each ran their own crews of soldiers and associates. It was less like a gang and more like a corporation, with titles, hierarchies, and clear flows of money upward. Paul liked that. It made sense to him. In many ways, it wasn't much different from how legitimate businesses ran, except the product wasn't meat or groceries. It was power. The waterfront rackets fascinated him most. The docks were veins through which New York's lifeblood pulsed. Every crate that moved, every shipment unloaded, passed through hands the Mafia controlled. It wasn't just about stealing. It was about regulating. You wanted your cargo to move safely? You paid. You wanted your workers to avoid harassment? You paid. Paul found it brilliant in its simplicity. Control the flow of goods, and you controlled the city itself. But the work hardened him. He began to see people less as individuals and more as accounts, some profitable, some problematic. That detachment was necessary. In a world where sentiment could be mistaken for weakness, he learned to bury whatever pity surfaced. He told himself it was just business, and in time, it felt true. By the early 1940s, Paul was trusted enough to handle bigger responsibilities. One involved overseeing loan sharking operations, lending money at crushing interest to desperate men who had nowhere else to turn. To Paul, it was another form of butchery. You gave a man credit, like handing him a slab of meat, and then you carved off piece by piece until nothing was left but bone. If he fell behind, you didn't just collect money. You collected dignity, control. Paul thrived because he never overplayed his hand. He didn't scream threats in alleys. He let fear do the talking. He cultivated an image of stability, someone who could be counted on. In a world of hot-headed killers, that made him stand out. Still, his rise wasn't without risks. Law enforcement kept one eye on the docks, another on the streets. Raids, arrests, interrogations, they were constant hazards. One night, Paul was picked up along with a few associates. In the station, a detective leaned close, promising leniency if Paul talked. Paul just stared back, stone-faced, saying nothing. Hours dragged on, but he never cracked. When he was finally released, word spread fast. Silence was loyalty, and loyalty was survival. That single act, refusing to speak, elevated him in the eyes of his family more than any amount of money could. Yet beneath the surface, Paul wrestled with the duality of his life. By day, he could slice meat in the shop, chatting with neighbors who saw him as nothing more than a hard-working butcher. By night, he slipped into the underworld, where every handshake was a deal and every glance carried meaning. The two lives blurred, but he managed them with care. It was a balancing act, one apron clean, one hand always dirty. The city itself seemed to mirror his transformation. Brooklyn's neighborhoods were shifting, immigrant families clawing their way upward, crime families entrenching themselves deeper into the city's fabric. The Great Depression had scarred everyone, but for the Mafia, it had been opportunity. They had fed on desperation, turning it into wealth. Paul stepped neatly into that machine, another cog, but one with the ambition to one day steer it. Still, the future was uncertain. The Mangano family was powerful, but internal tensions simmered. Rivals watched for weaknesses. Ambitions clashed behind closed doors. Paul sensed it, even if he wasn't yet at the center of it. The world he had entered was one of constant shifts, where loyalty could turn to betrayal overnight. One night, as he closed up the butcher shop, he lingered over the lock. The street was quiet, only the faint sound of a trolley in the distance. He thought about his father, who had dreamed of a simple life for his children, slicing meat, serving neighbors, living clean. Paul knew he had already strayed too far from that dream. The shop was a mask now, nothing more. His real future was being written elsewhere, in whispered deals and envelopes of cash. The boy who once stood behind the counter was gone. In his place stood a man stepping firmly into the world of the Mafia, where every gain came with a shadow, and every shadow carried a knife. He didn't know it yet, but the next steps would push him deeper, into a game far bigger than protection money and loan sharking, into unions, industries, and fortunes that would reshape not just Brooklyn, but all of New York. And with each step, Paul Castellano moved closer to the destiny that would one day place him at the head of the most powerful family in America, and also closer to the betrayal that would end it all. The sound of silence can be louder than any gunshot. In the world Paul Castellano was stepping into, silence was everything. It was survival, respect, and the line between life and death. One word spoken to the wrong person could unravel entire empires. And Paul, still in his early years in the Mafia, was already learning that lesson in ways that would shape him forever. There was a moment burned into his memory. A man from the neighborhood had been picked up by the police after a small hijacking job went wrong. He wasn't a made man, just an associate, someone low on the ladder. But in that interrogation room, under the pressure of detectives promising freedom in exchange for names, he cracked. The fallout was immediate. By the next week, that man's name was no longer whispered in the cafes or the bars. He had vanished, erased like chalk wiped from a board. Paul didn't need anyone to spell it out. The man had broken omerta, the code of silence. And breaking omerta meant you no longer existed. For Paul, it was both terrifying and enlightening. He realized the Mafia wasn't held together just by money or violence. It was held together by loyalty stronger than blood. Families might quarrel, neighbors might gossip, but within the Mafia, silence was sacred. You protected the family with your life, and in return, the family protected you. This idea of family wasn't the kind he had grown up with in his father's butcher shop, where the biggest concern was making sure customers got the right cut of meat. This was something deeper, darker, but also strangely comforting. Blood bound you to people, but the Mafia created a second kind of blood, chosen loyalty that ran just as deep. Paul was being pulled into both at once. His connection to Carlo Gambino was crucial. Through Carlo, Paul saw firsthand how family ties and Mafia loyalty overlapped until they were inseparable. At gatherings, Carlo would remind younger men in quiet tones that honor and loyalty outlasted everything else. Paul listened carefully, absorbing the lesson like scripture. He watched how Carlo dealt with men who faltered, never loud, never rash, but decisive. Mistakes could be forgiven, but betrayal could not. Paul began to mirror this mentality in his own dealings. When he collected payments from store owners, he didn't just demand money. He built relationships. He reminded them that as long as they paid, they had nothing to fear. In his own way, he was already weaving the web of loyalty that would one day define his rule. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted devotion. But devotion came with sacrifice. Paul had to show his own loyalty, prove it in ways that went beyond words. On one occasion, he was questioned by police after a raid connected to waterfront extortion. He sat in a cell for hours while detectives circled him, dangling offers of leniency. The temptation was there, an easier way out, a chance to walk free. But Paul never flinched. He repeated the same line over and over. He didn't know anything. Silence wasn't just his defense. It was his weapon. When he was finally released, the word spread through the family like fire. Paul had kept omerta. That silence earned him more respect than any amount of money ever could. Still, loyalty wasn't always clean or easy. There were moments that left scars, moments when loyalty meant watching something brutal and not intervening. Paul witnessed men punished for stepping out of line, beatings in alleys, whispers of bodies dumped in rivers. Each time, he had to steel himself, reminding his heart that loyalty demanded acceptance. In the Mafia, loyalty wasn't about protecting everyone. It was about protecting the family's code, no matter the cost. These lessons didn't just shape Paul as a gangster. They shaped him as a man. He learned to measure his words, to weigh his promises carefully, to never forget a favor given or a slight endured. He understood that in this world, trust was the only currency more valuable than cash. You could lose money and earn it back. Lose trust, and you lost everything. What set Paul apart was how he internalized these values. Many young mobsters followed the code because they feared the consequences. Paul followed it because he believed in it. To him, omerta wasn't just a rule. It was the foundation of an empire. Silence created stability, and stability created power. This belief began to separate him from the average soldier. He wasn't just another man running the streets, chasing quick scores. He was thinking bigger, longer term. He saw loyalty not as a leash, but as mortar holding the Mafia's bricks together. Without it, everything would crumble. And yet, there was a shadow to this way of life. Paul understood that the same code that protected him could also be his undoing. Loyalty demanded that he put the family above everything else, even above his own conscience. If the family asked, you obeyed. If the family demanded silence, you stayed silent, even if it meant watching an innocent suffer. The line between right and wrong blurred until all that remained was the question, is it good for the family? At home, his wife and children saw a man who worked hard at the butcher shop, a man who kept food on the table and a roof over their heads. But inside, Paul was already living by another set of vows. The butcher's apron had become camouflage. The real Paul was shaping himself into someone who could rise within the Mafia, someone whose name carried weight, someone who could be trusted not just with money, but with secrets. The weight of those secrets grew heavier with time. He knew the names of men who ordered killings. He knew which businesses were fronts and which politicians were paid off. Every detail he carried inside him became another lock on his lips, another test of his loyalty. And with every test, he proved himself. By the late 1940s, Paul Castellano was no longer just the butcher's son who happened to have a powerful brother-in-law. He was becoming a man respected within the Mangano family, someone whose silence and loyalty made him invaluable. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but in many ways, that made him more dangerous. The loud ones drew attention. Paul preferred shadows. But shadows can be deceptive. Behind them, rivalries were brewing within the Mafia itself. Bosses were plotting, families were shifting alliances, and whispers of betrayal carried through the air. Paul was still a small piece in that larger game, but he was learning fast. He knew that survival depended not only on loyalty, but on recognizing when others' loyalty was about to break. The lessons of blood and loyalty were seared into him, but they came with a question he couldn't shake. How far could loyalty be stretched before it snapped? Could silence always protect you, or could it one day bury you? The answer was waiting in the years ahead, when loyalty would be tested in ways Paul couldn't yet imagine, when family ties would clash with ambition, and the very code that had built him would hold the power to destroy him. And as the streets of Brooklyn darkened with the rise of new power struggles, Paul Castellano was about to step closer to the storm. The barbershop was quiet, almost too quiet. On that October morning in 1957, a man leaned back in a chair, a white sheet draped across his chest, steam rising faintly from the towels wrapped around his face. It should have been an ordinary moment, a ritual of grooming and calm. Instead, it became one of the most infamous executions in Mafia history. Two men walked in, pistols raised, and before the victim could react, the air cracked with gunfire. Bullets ripped through flesh, glass shattered, and the man slumped, lifeless, in a pool of his own blood. His name was Albert Anastasia, and with his death, the balance of power in New York shifted forever. Paul Castellano wasn't there in the barbershop that morning, but he didn't need to be. He felt the shockwave like every other man in the Mafia did. Anastasia had been the boss of their family, feared as the Lord High Executioner, the man who once commanded Murder Incorporated. His reputation was built on violence, so ruthless it seemed untouchable. Yet even he had fallen, gunned down mid-shave, the white sheet across his body stained crimson. For Paul, the message was clear. No one, no matter how feared, was safe. The assassination left a vacuum, a dangerous void at the top of one of the most powerful Mafia families in America. And into that void stepped a man Paul knew better than most, his brother-in-law, Carlo Gambino. It was a move as shocking as it was calculated. Gambino wasn't known for outbursts of violence. He wasn't a man who strutted or shouted. He was quiet, reserved, a strategist who preferred chess to fistfights. And yet, somehow, he had outmaneuvered rivals and emerged as the new boss. For Paul, it was both a personal turning point and an opportunity. He had spent years proving himself, earning through extortion, loan sharking, and quiet loyalty. Now, with Carlo at the top, doors opened that had once been sealed shut. Loyalty to Carlo wasn't just about family anymore. It was about survival, advancement, and the chance to become more than a soldier in the ranks. Carlo rewarded him with trust. Paul was elevated to the position of capo, captain. In Mafia terms, a capo was like a middle manager, but one with teeth. A capo commanded his own crew of soldiers and associates, men who reported directly to him. He collected their earnings, enforced discipline, and made sure the flow of money traveled upward. In return, he earned a cut of everything, a steady river of cash that grew his own wealth while solidifying his position. The promotion wasn't just about money. It was about influence. Paul now had men who looked to him for guidance, who waited for his word before acting. In a world where reputation meant everything, that respect was intoxicating. He was no longer simply following orders. He was giving them. Yet with power came responsibility, and responsibility in the Mafia was never clean. When a soldier failed to pay his dues, Paul had to enforce the consequences. When a rival threatened territory, Paul had to defend it. It meant making decisions that weighed loyalty against survival, profit against blood. Every choice carved deeper lines into who he was becoming. Not just Paul the butcher's son, but Paul the man who could command fear and loyalty in equal measure. The timing of his rise was crucial. The late 1950s were a period of transformation for the American Mafia. The five families of New York were solidifying their control, but law enforcement was beginning to pay closer attention. The infamous Appalachian meeting in 1957, where dozens of mob leaders from across the country were arrested at a secluded estate in upstate New York, proved that the Mafia was no longer operating in the shadows unnoticed. The FBI was watching now, listening, waiting. Paul saw it as both a warning and an opportunity. The old way of ruling through sheer violence, the Anastasia way, was crumbling. A new model was rising, quieter, smarter, less flashy. Carlo Gambino embodied it, and Paul aligned himself completely with that vision. He began to focus not only on the traditional rackets, but also on legitimate-seeming businesses. Construction, unions, trucking. industries that provided endless opportunities to skim money while appearing respectable on the surface. The butcher shop remained part of his cover, but now it was just a relic of who he had once been. Paul was thinking bigger, and he wanted more than just survival. He wanted control. He wanted to be indispensable. And under Carlo, he was learning how to build an empire not with bullets alone, but with contracts, alliances, and patience. Still, the echoes of Anastasia's bloody and haunted him. It was proof that the Mafia's code of loyalty had limits, that ambition could outweigh fear, that even the most powerful boss could fall if the right men decided it was time. Paul kept that lesson close. Power was never permanent. It had to be guarded constantly, built carefully, and cloaked in respect. Carlo seemed to understand this better than anyone. He ruled not with theatrics, but with subtlety. He let others take the spotlight while he pulled the strings from behind. Paul admired this style and imitated it. He knew the loud ones often burned brightest and fell fastest. He didn't want to burn. He wanted to endure. His crew began to reflect his personality. They were steady earners, not headline grabbers. They worked the rackets quietly, keeping the flow of money strong while avoiding unnecessary attention. Paul taught them that fear was effective, but respect lasted longer. It was the same lesson he had once learned slicing meat with his father. Cut too deeply, and you ruined the whole piece. Cut carefully, and you got the most out of it. As the 1950s turned into the 60s, Paul's reputation grew. He was seen as reliable, intelligent, and above all, loyal to Carlo. Loyalty was the thread running through his entire life, from the butcher shop to the backrooms of the Mangano family, and now into his role as capo. And with Carlo's rise, Paul's loyalty was finally paying off in ways his younger self could have only imagined. But there was an unspoken truth beneath it all. The same way Anastasia had been removed, one day Carlo would be too. Every boss eventually fell, whether by bullets or by age. And when that day came, the question would be who stood ready to inherit the empire. Paul didn't say it aloud, not even to himself. But the thought lingered like a whisper in the back of his mind. He wasn't just serving Carlo. He was learning from him, preparing for something greater. The White House Don wasn't born yet, but the foundations were being laid, brick by quiet brick. Still, the future held storms he couldn't predict. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Law enforcement was tightening its grip. And ambition, the same ambition that had put Carlo in power, was always waiting to strike again. Paul Castellano had stepped firmly into the world of leadership. He was no longer just an apprentice, no longer just a butcher's son playing at the edges of crime. He was a capo in the Gambino family, entrusted with men, money, and influence. But the lesson of Anastasia's death remained carved into his mind. Power could be taken in an instant, washed away in a storm of bullets. And as Paul looked toward the future, he knew one thing for certain. The higher he climbed, the more dangerous the fall. And the climb had only just begun. It began not with a gunshot, but with a handshake. In a smoky backroom, while other mobsters boasted about the muscle they could summon and the enemies they had buried, Paul Castellano was talking about contracts, unions, and construction bids. He leaned back in his chair, speaking calmly, almost like a businessman explaining quarterly profits. And in that quiet, controlled tone, he revealed his vision. The Mafia didn't need to always operate in the shadows of alleyways. It could sit in boardrooms, wearing suits, and bleed money from the very foundations of New York City itself. Paul had seen the lesson etched in Albert Anastasia's bloody end. Violence made headlines, but headlines attracted cops, and cops brought heat that burned families to the ground. Violence was necessary, yes, but it was a tool, not a business plan. Paul wanted more. He wanted streams of money that couldn't be traced back to a single broken window or a hijacked truck. He wanted legitimacy, not in the moral sense, but in the financial sense. He wanted to wear the face of respectability while pulling the strings of corruption underneath. The timing was perfect. New York in the 1960s and 70s was booming with construction. Skyscrapers clawed at the skyline, bridges and highways stretched across boroughs, and concrete flowed like water. Every new project meant millions of dollars, and millions of dollars meant opportunity. But in construction, As in every corner of New York, there was always a gatekeeper. Castellano made sure that gatekeeper was him. To understand his genius, you have to picture concrete not as a material, but as gold. Every building, every sidewalk, every road depended on it. Control the supply, and you controlled the pace of the city itself. Paul orchestrated what became known quietly as the Concrete Club. Major construction companies, those who wanted their projects completed on time and without problems, were forced to buy their concrete from mob-approved suppliers. The prices were inflated, of course, but paying them ensured trucks didn't go missing, supplies didn't mysteriously dry up, and projects didn't grind to a halt. It was extortion, but wrapped in the packaging of business. And it was brilliant. Unlike a street shakedown, there were no broken noses, no smashed storefronts. Just paperwork, contracts, and the kind of fear that never made it into police reports. Developers paid because they couldn't afford not to. The Mafia had found a way to make itself indispensable, like a silent partner who always got a cut. For Paul, this was the future of organized crime. He had grown up watching men throw punches, pull triggers, and end up in prison cells. He didn't want to be remembered as another thug who bled out on a sidewalk. He wanted to be the man who sat in his Staten Island mansion, the so-called White House, counting millions while the city itself unknowingly worked for him. But this approach also made him different from other bosses, and not everyone respected it. To the old-school, blue-collar gangsters, Paul looked soft. He wasn't in the streets, running numbers or cracking heads. He was in meetings with businessmen, talking about supply chains and percentages. Some of the soldiers under him muttered that he had forgotten what it meant to be a gangster. But Paul knew better. He hadn't forgotten. He had evolved. He believed money earned through quiet corruption was safer than money earned through loud violence. A truck hijacking could bring the cops in a matter of hours. But a rigged union contract could pay out for years without anyone blinking. It was the difference between hunting once and feasting for a night, versus planting a seed that grew into an endless harvest. Unions became another weapon in his arsenal. The Mafia had always understood the power of unions. Control the workers, and you controlled the city's heartbeat. Paul leaned into this with surgical precision. He made sure that union leaders were either in his pocket or removed entirely. A strike could cripple a project, and a project delayed cost millions. He turned that fear into leverage. Pay the family, and the workers would keep moving. Resist, and the concrete would stop pouring, the cranes would sit idle, and deadlines would be missed. Paul liked to say that he didn't need to raise his voice. He let the clock do the talking. Developers who tried to resist soon found themselves drowning in delays, bleeding money with every passing day. Sooner or later, they came crawling back, ready to pay whatever it took to get things moving again. The money was staggering. Tens of millions flowed upward, and Paul's reputation grew with it. He wasn't just another mobster anymore. He was something new, a hybrid of gangster and corporate executive. The butcher had turned businessman, and in doing so, he was reshaping what the Mafia could be. But there was a trade-off. His focus on white-collar crime distanced him from the men on the streets. Soldiers who lived and died by hijackings, gambling dens, and drug deals felt disconnected from their boss. They wanted a leader who shared their dirt, someone who knew the weight of a pistol in his hand and the sting of blood on his knuckles. Paul gave them none of that. He gave them rules, business strategies, and a mansion that made him look more like a Wall Street mogul than a crime boss. Still, his power only grew. He cultivated connections not just in New York, but across the country. Construction companies in other cities began to feel the reach of his influence. The Gambino family's wealth expanded, and for a time, it seemed untouchable. Behind closed doors, though, Paul was changing. He spent more time in tailored suits than in neighborhood clubs. He surrounded himself with business figures, accountants, and lawyers who helped him launder money through legitimate fronts. He became fascinated with technology, reading about new ways to manage businesses more efficiently. While other bosses worried about who owed them money from card games, Paul was thinking about corporate structures, supply chains, and long-term investments. It gave him an aura of sophistication, but it also bred resentment. To many in his crew, Paul felt distant, untouchable. They respected his power but doubted his loyalty to the street life that had raised them. And resentment in the Mafia was like a slow-growing crack in concrete. It might not look dangerous at first, but given enough pressure, it could bring the whole structure crashing down. For Paul, the gamble was worth it. He believed the future of organized crime wasn't in alleys or smoky backrooms. It was in skyscrapers, contracts, and unions. He saw himself as a builder, not a brawler. A man who could shape the Mafia into something bigger than anyone had imagined. But there was one problem. In chasing legitimacy, Paul forgot that he was still a gangster. And gangsters, no matter how polished, no matter how wealthy, still lived by the code of the street. The men beneath him didn't care about contracts or construction monopolies. They cared about respect. They cared about being heard, being valued. And when they looked up at Paul's White House mansion, they didn't see a leader who represented them. They saw a man who had climbed so high above the street that he could no longer hear its voice. The butcher had turned businessman, yes. But in doing so, he had planted seeds of resentment that would one day grow into betrayal. And as Paul Castellano counted his millions, seated comfortably in his Staten Island palace, he had no way of knowing that the very men meant to protect him were already beginning to wonder if their loyalty had a price. The image of Paul Castellano that most men carried was not of him holding a gun, but of him sitting behind a polished desk, quietly leafing through contracts while a cigar burned slowly at his side. He didn't look like the gangsters who strutted through nightclubs or parked Cadillacs outside smoky bars. He looked like a corporate executive, calm, serious, and deliberate. That was the secret to his empire. He made the Mafia look like business, and business look like the Mafia. By the 1960s, Paul had already moved far beyond the street rackets that kept so many of his men occupied. Gambling, hijackings, protection money, those still brought in cash, but Paul saw them as scraps compared to what could be earned by infiltrating legitimate industries. He saw an entire city, its construction sites, labor unions, food markets, and trucking routes, not as places to steal from, but as corporations waiting to be conquered. Where others saw rackets, Paul saw boardrooms. Where others saw gang wars, he saw mergers and acquisitions. The brilliance of it lay in appearance. If you walked past one of his companies, you might never know it was mob-owned. The signs were professional. The workers carried lunch pails. The paperwork was filed neatly in offices that looked no different from any other business. But behind the scenes, those companies were feeding profits directly into Castellano's pocket. He had turned the idea of a front into something far more sophisticated. Entire businesses that were both functional and criminal, wearing legitimacy like a mask. Labor racketeering became one of his sharpest tools. To most, a union was simply a group of workers demanding fair wages and safe conditions. To Paul, it was leverage incarnate. If he controlled the union leadership, he controlled when projects started, when they stopped, and how much they cost. Developers learned quickly that delays could cost millions, and those delays were always just one phone call away if Paul wanted them. It was extortion disguised as negotiation, pressure applied through paperwork instead of broken bones. And it worked beautifully. Every handshake Paul made with a union boss was like planting a flag in new territory. He infiltrated the Teamsters, construction unions, food distribution unions, each one giving him invisible control over essential arteries of the city. If a contractor wanted his project to go smoothly, if a supermarket chain wanted its trucks to arrive on time, if a builder wanted his concrete delivered, they all knew where to turn. And Paul didn't need to threaten them outright. The possibility of disruption was enough. The city moved when he allowed it to move. This strategy earned him a reputation, one that set him apart even within the Mafia. He became known as the Howard Hughes of the mob. The comparison wasn't accidental. Like Hughes, the eccentric billionaire, Paul had an obsession with business detail and the illusion of legitimacy. But where Hughes was consumed by innovation and aviation, Paul was consumed by control and profit. He wore tailored suits, spent long hours in his Staten Island mansion poring over financial records, and preferred meetings with accountants over confrontations with rival gangs. He was, in his own eyes, a businessman first and a gangster second. But beneath that businessman's exterior, the reality of his empire was still rooted in fear. For every contract signed, there was an unspoken threat. For every handshake, a shadow of violence loomed behind it. Workers who challenged his authority were beaten. Union leaders who refused to play along were replaced, sometimes willingly, sometimes by force. The system ran on intimidation, but Paul had polished it so well that it often looked like cooperation. His soldiers, however, weren't always impressed. Many of them came from the streets, men who had fought, bled, and killed to make their bones. To them, Castellano seemed more like a corporate suit than a mob boss. They respected his money, but they didn't always respect the man. In their eyes, he wasn't the kind of leader who understood what it meant to get his hands dirty. And yet, whether they liked it or not, they depended on him. His empire brought in more money than they could dream of on their own. Paul didn't care if they muttered behind his back. What mattered to him was stability. He believed the Mafia could only survive if it stopped acting like a street gang and started behaving like a corporation. The old days of machine guns and headline-grabbing bloodbaths were fading. The real power now lay in infiltration, of unions, of legitimate businesses, even of politics. Paul wanted the Gambino family to be untouchable, hidden behind contracts, balance sheets, and respectable company logos. He had his mansion, the White House, as people called it, as a symbol of that vision. It wasn't just a home. It was a fortress of wealth, a declaration that he had elevated himself above the dirty streets of Brooklyn. From there, he ran his affairs like a CEO, summoning men to his office, reviewing profits, and deciding which projects to back. He rarely appeared in the nightclubs or the smoky backrooms where so many mobsters spent their time. He lived apart, not just in distance, but in mindset. This separation created tension. To his men, Paul was drifting too far from the street. To Paul, his men were stuck in the past. It was a divide that would one day prove fatal. But in these years, his empire grew, and with it, his sense of invulnerability. Yet, every empire has cracks. Paul's obsession with respectability sometimes blinded him to the resentment it stirred. When he forced businessmen into deals, they resented the quiet extortion. When he demanded loyalty from his soldiers but offered them little face-to-face contact, they resented the distance. And when law enforcement began to catch whispers of the concrete club and the infiltration of unions, they didn't see a businessman. They saw a gangster hiding behind paperwork. Paul didn't fully grasp it yet, but the very system he believed would protect him was leaving trails for investigators to follow. Unlike a hijacking or a street shooting, corporate corruption left paper, and paper could be traced. Still, in his mind, he was untouchable. He compared himself not to mobsters like Albert Anastasia or Vito Genovese, but to men in skyscrapers who built legitimate fortunes. He saw himself as their equal, even if his empire was built on fear. That belief hardened him, made him less approachable, less willing to bend. He was the White House Don now, and in his view, the family would rise or fall according to his vision. But visions have a price, and the higher Paul Castellano built his empire, the further he drifted from the men who had once stood beside him. The butcher had become the businessman, and the businessman had become a symbol. To his enemies, he was powerful. To his men, he was distant. And as Paul tightened his grip on the concrete and the unions, forces were already gathering against him. Forces he could not see from behind the polished windows of his White House mansion. For every empire that rises, there comes a moment when loyalty is tested, when ambition whispers treason, and when the shadows remind even the most powerful that the streets never forget. And Paul Castellano, sitting behind his desk counting the millions flowing into his empire, had no idea how quickly those shadows were beginning to move. On a quiet hill in Staten Island, far from the cramped butcher shops of Brooklyn, the sound of hammers and saws carried through the air. Workers hauled lumber, mixed cement, and laid the bones of a mansion unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. Day by day, brick by brick, a palace rose, white, gleaming, sprawling across acres of manicured land. For the man who ordered its construction, it was more than a home. It was a monument, A statement to the world that he was no longer just a capo, no longer just a butcher turned racketeer. He was a king. The mansion quickly earned a nickname, the White House. Locals used it half-jokingly, but there was truth behind the humor. Its pale facade, wide columns, and sheer size set it apart from everything around it. It loomed over Staten Island like a castle, towering not only in structure but in symbolism. For Paul Castellano, it wasn't just a residence. It was proof that he had risen above the dirt and noise of the streets, that he had built something permanent in a world where permanence rarely existed. But symbols have a way of cutting both ways. To Paul, the mansion was his triumph. To his soldiers, it was a wall. The man who had once stood beside them in Brooklyn was now removed, distant, peering down from a mansion that looked more like it belonged to a billionaire than to a gangster. The White House became a reminder that their boss no longer walked the same streets, no longer lived the same life. It was the embodiment of the gap between Paul's vision and his men's reality. Inside, the mansion was as extravagant as its exterior. Chandeliers hung from ceilings, marble floors gleamed, and expensive art decorated the walls. There were sprawling dining rooms where Paul entertained carefully chosen guests, private offices where deals were discussed, and quiet corners where whispers of strategy filled the air. The kitchen was massive, outfitted like a professional restaurant, because Paul, ever the butcher at heart, still loved food, still believed meals were a way to bind men together. Yet the house also revealed his obsession with control. Cameras lined the property. Guards patrolled the grounds. Gates and fences sealed him off from the outside world. He wasn't just living in a mansion. He was living in a fortress. Safety was an illusion in the Mafia, and Paul knew it. But he tried to build that illusion anyway, brick by brick, gate by gate. The neighbors noticed. They whispered about the strange, powerful man behind the gates, the man whose mansion seemed too large, too polished, too out of place for Staten Island. They didn't see a mob boss. They saw a rich recluse, a man who rarely mingled, who rarely smiled, who seemed more interested in empire than community. The mansion became infamous in its own right, a physical extension of Paul's personality, imposing, controlled, and unreachable. For Paul, every room in that house carried meaning. The dining table wasn't just for meals. It was a stage for displaying wealth and power. The office wasn't just for paperwork. It was a throne room where his decisions rippled outward into the city. He walked those halls with quiet pride, believing he had built something his children and grandchildren could inherit, something that would last beyond his own years. But for his men, the White House was a reminder of distance. They stood outside its walls, waiting for invitations that rarely came. When they were summoned, they entered cautiously, sitting at his polished tables, staring at the wealth that surrounded him, feeling both awe and resentment. They respected the money, but they missed the grit. To them, Paul was becoming something less like a gangster and more like a businessman who had forgotten the blood price of the streets. The irony was that Paul thought the mansion tied him closer to his roots. In his mind, the butcher's son had finally carved out a place of permanence. No more cramped apartments. No more tenements filled with noise. This was security. This was the future. But in trying to rise above, he had separated himself, and separation in the Mafia was dangerous. A boss who was too distant could no longer feel the pulse of his men. Still, Paul loved his fortress. He loved the ritual of walking through its halls, of sitting in the office he had designed to resemble a corporate executive's den, of hosting select family members and allies in dining rooms filled with laughter and wine. He saw himself not as a thug hiding from the law, but as a patriarch, a builder, a man who had elevated the Gambino family into a realm of sophistication. The FBI, however, saw something else. They saw a symbol of arrogance, a beacon drawing attention. To them, the White House wasn't a fortress. It was a target. If they could plant bugs inside, they would hear the whispers of power at its source. And in time, they would. Hidden microphones captured conversations that revealed Paul not only as a businessman, but as a gangster discussing murders, betrayals, and deals that stretched across the city. The mansion that was meant to protect him would eventually betray him. But in those early years, Paul walked its halls with confidence. He believed he had insulated himself. He believed the gates and guards kept him safe. He believed the White House would stand as proof of his genius long after he was gone. And yet, every fortress has cracks. Behind the gates, behind the marble and chandeliers, Paul couldn't hear the growing resentment of the men who felt left behind. He couldn't see the suspicion building in law enforcement, who were beginning to focus not just on the street thugs, but on the white-collar don in his Staten Island palace. The mansion stood tall, gleaming, and silent. A monument to power, a symbol of distance, a fortress built to last. But as history would prove, even the strongest walls cannot keep out betrayal. And behind those gates, as Paul Castellano sat in his White House, the seeds of his downfall were already being sown. In a dimly lit room miles away from the noise of the streets, the most powerful men in American organized crime gathered around a polished table. Their faces were familiar only to one another. Their names whispered with caution outside those walls. This was not a gang meeting. It was not a brawl in an alley or a drunken deal in a bar. This was the Mafia Commission, the invisible boardroom that shaped the destiny of Cosa Nostra. And sitting among them, calm and deliberate, was Paul Castellano. The commission had been formed decades earlier as a way to prevent chaos. The old wars of the Mafia had left bodies in alleys and newspapers filled with stories that threatened the survival of the entire organization. The commission was the solution, a council of bosses from the 5 families of New York, along with representatives from Chicago and other major families. It was, in effect, a corporate board of directors for the underworld. Every family was its own company, but the commission was the stock exchange where rules were written and disputes settled. For Castellano, being at that table was not just an honor. It was validation. He had risen from a butcher's apron to a seat among men who decided the fate of the Mafia itself. It was proof that his vision of power, quiet, calculated, white-collar, was not only working but was being recognized at the highest level. When the commission met, the discussions were not loud arguments. They were cold, deliberate conversations where words weighed as heavily as bullets. Territories were divided, policies enforced, punishments agreed upon. It was politics, but the kind where failure meant death. Castellano thrived in this environment. He wasn't a man for backroom bar fights. He was a man for boardrooms, where patience and calculation carried the day. One of his strongest influences on the commission was in shaping the Mafia's relationship with unions and legitimate industries. He argued that the future of organized crime wasn't just in gambling dens and drug deals. It was in construction, labor racketeering, and industries that generated millions while keeping the Mafia cloaked in the appearance of respectability. He pushed for the kind of control that turned entire cities into revenue streams, the kind of rackets that didn't just skim cash, but built financial empires. Not everyone agreed with him. Some bosses still clung to the old ways, to the fast money of the streets and the violent displays of dominance. To them, Castellano seemed almost arrogant, as though he looked down on the traditions of the Mafia that had raised them all. But Paul stood firm. He spoke in calm tones, presenting his ideas with the confidence of a man who believed time was on his side. And more often than not, his voice carried weight. It wasn't just his vision that earned him respect. It was his loyalty to Carlo Gambino. When Gambino had taken the family's throne after Anastasia's murder, he brought Castellano deeper into the circle of power. Paul learned how Gambino used the commission not as a debating hall, but as a tool to cement dominance. Gambino's quiet control of the Gambino family extended outward through the commission, and Paul was his apprentice in that strategy. By the time Gambino died, Paul was prepared to inherit not only a family, but also a seat at the table where history was shaped. The commission wasn't infallible. It couldn't stop every feud, couldn't prevent every eruption of violence. But its existence meant that the Mafia presented itself less as a swarm of thugs and more as an organized entity. It was a government within a government, a shadow authority operating beneath the nose of the state. Castellano embraced this identity. To him, being part of the commission wasn't about titles. It was about legitimacy. If the Mafia was a nation, then the commission was its Senate. and he was one of its senators. Still, every meeting carried risk. The bosses gathered under heavy secrecy, each one knowing that betrayal could lurk in any corner. There were always suspicions: who might be talking to the FBI, who might be plotting behind closed doors, who might one day decide to settle scores with bullets instead of words. Castellano, with his careful manner, presented himself as steady, loyal, and pragmatic. But he knew the truth. The commission was a house built on shifting sand. It could hold firm for years, then collapse in a single night of treachery. The commission also gave Paul the opportunity to extend his influence beyond New York. Through it, he forged connections with bosses from other cities, expanding the Gambino family's reach into trucking, food distribution, and meat markets across the country. It was an extension of his butcher roots, but now the scale was national. He had gone from cutting meat for customers in Brooklyn to controlling the supply lines that fed millions. And the commission gave him cover, legitimacy within the Mafia world to pursue these ambitions without appearing reckless. But power at that level came with enemies. Some saw Castellano's style as weakness, his obsession with business as a betrayal of tradition. Others resented his closeness to Gambino, whispering that his rise was due more to family ties than to his own merit. These whispers grew louder as Castellano pushed harder for his vision of the Mafia's future, one where men carried briefcases instead of pistols, where influence was measured not in fear but in contracts. Yet even as he sat among the most powerful men of organized crime, Castellano remained haunted by a simple truth: the commission was not eternal. It was a fragile alliance, held together by fear and convenience. At any moment, it could turn. Alliances could fracture, loyalties could shift, and decisions could spark wars. Castellano had seen it happen before, when Anastasia fell. He knew it could happen again. Every time he left a commission meeting, stepping out into the night with the weight of decisions echoing in his mind, he carried both pride and unease. Pride that he had risen so high, unease that the higher he climbed, the further he had to fall. The butcher's son was now shaping the policies of the American Mafia. But he knew the same men who shook his hand at the table would not hesitate to cut him down if the wind shifted. The commission had given him legitimacy, wealth, and influence. But it had also placed him squarely in the crosshairs of ambition, envy, and betrayal. And as Castellano returned to his Staten Island palace, reviewing contracts and counting profits, he could not hear the whispers growing louder on the streets. Whispers that one day, his vision of the Mafia would clash violently with the men who believed he had drifted too far from the code that bound them all. The commission had elevated him, but it also made him visible. And in the world of Cosa Nostra, visibility was the first step toward vulnerability. The night Carlo Gambino died, the air in New York felt heavier. It was October of 1976, and with his last breath, one of the most powerful Mafia dons in American history left behind a vacuum large enough to shake the underworld to its core. For nearly 2 decades, Gambino had ruled quietly, carefully, avoiding the flamboyance that had doomed other bosses. He had kept his empire stable, his men loyal, and his name whispered with reverence. Now, as his body cooled, the question of succession burned hotter than ever. Who would inherit the crown of the Gambino family? Most assumed the answer was clear. Aniello Della Croce, Gambino's long-serving underboss, was respected on the streets. He had spent years enforcing loyalty, keeping soldiers in line, and maintaining the day-to-day order of the family. He was the face of the blue-collar faction, the kind of gangster who still shook hands in smoky bars and listened to the concerns of men who made their bones with pistols and fists. For them, Della Croce wasn't just the logical choice. He was the only choice. But Carlo Gambino had other plans. With his death, a sealed message was revealed. Paul Castellano would take the throne. Not Della Croce, not the soldier's underboss, but the butcher's son turned businessman. A man who preferred contracts to street fights, who lived in a mansion instead of a social club, who saw the Mafia not as a fraternity of soldiers, but as a corporation to be managed. In that single decision, Gambino had rewritten the rules of succession. The news landed like a grenade. Soldiers muttered in disbelief. Capos exchanged nervous glances. Delacroce himself was caught off guard, though he masked it with stoicism. He had lived long enough to know that protesting a decision made from beyond the grave was pointless. But inside, resentment brewed, not necessarily in him, but in the men who had followed him for decades. To them, Castellano was no boss. He was an outsider in their own world, a man who had turned his back on the grit of the streets in favor of the polished safety of boardrooms. For Castellano, it was both triumph and burden. He had been chosen, handpicked by the most cunning boss of the era. That validation carried immense weight. But he knew what came with it: suspicion, envy, and the slow-burning hostility of men who believed the throne should have gone elsewhere. He stepped into power not with unanimous support, but with fractured loyalty at his back. Still, Paul embraced the role in his own style. Where Gambino had ruled with subtlety, Castellano ruled with the precision of a CEO. He called meetings like board conferences, analyzing profits, demanding accountability, tightening control over every racket. To him, being boss wasn't about swagger. It was about efficiency, order, and discipline. He demanded reports from his capos as though they were department heads, and he kept a close eye on money as if it were quarterly revenue. This approach impressed some. The construction rackets, unions, and concrete monopolies flourished under his watch. Millions flowed upward, making the Gambino family one of the wealthiest in the country. But for many soldiers, the distance between them and their new boss widened. Castellano didn't spend nights at the Rave Night social club like Delacroce had. He didn't linger in bars or roll up his sleeves among the men. He stayed in his White House mansion, summoning only those he needed, leaving the rest to wonder if he even saw them as part of his empire. That distance cut deeper than Paul realized. In the Mafia, respect wasn't only measured in money. It was measured in presence, in touch, in a boss's willingness to share space with the men who bled for him. Castellano thought money would buy loyalty. The soldiers thought loyalty had to be earned face to face. The tension was silent but unmistakable, like cracks forming in concrete, small at first, but destined to spread. Aniello Delacroce tried to hold the factions together. He accepted Castellano's leadership outwardly, telling his men that they had no choice but to honor Gambino's wishes. But beneath the calm surface, the resentment festered. Delacroce's men whispered that Castellano had been handed the crown through favoritism, not merit. They wondered how long they were expected to follow a boss who rarely left his mansion, who seemed to look down on them, as if they were relics of a past he no longer respected. For Castellano, the irony was sharp. He believed he was elevating the family, transforming it from a street gang into a corporate empire. In his mind, he was protecting them all, ensuring long-term wealth and stability. But the very methods he thought would save the family were creating a divide that would one day threaten to destroy it. The FBI, watching from the outside, recognized the shift immediately. Castellano wasn't just another gangster. He was different, more polished, more sophisticated, harder to catch through traditional street surveillance. But the Bureau also saw the opportunity in the rift his succession created. Where unity had once made the Gambinos strong, division now made them vulnerable. The agents noted the resentment of Delacroce's men, the whispers of discontent, the possibility that the largest family in America might not be as unbreakable as it appeared. Inside the family, Castellano's first moves as boss reflected his priorities. He doubled down on the unions, tightened the grip on construction, and poured resources into industries that looked legitimate. He wanted distance from drugs, a business he saw as reckless and dangerous, even though many of his soldiers were already profiting from it. He wanted control of the family's image, its money, its operations. To him, this was leadership. To his men, it felt like dictatorship. And all the while, the memory of Carlo Gambino hung over them. Carlo had been both feared and respected. He had balanced the needs of businessmen and street soldiers, keeping the peace between factions. Castellano lacked that balance. He leaned too heavily into the businessman's world, leaving the soldiers to feel neglected, even discarded. The cracks in loyalty didn't explode immediately. For a time, money kept the peace. The family continued to thrive financially, and outwardly, Castellano's reign looked stable. But beneath the surface, the resentment of Delacroix's faction simmered like coals under ash, waiting for the right gust of wind to ignite. And Paul, walking the polished halls of his White House, believed he had secured his place. He believed the succession had cemented him as the rightful heir. He believed the Gambino family was united under his vision of the future. But power in the Mafia is never given without cost. Carlo Gambino's final decision had crowned him king, yes, but it had also painted a target on his back, one that grew larger with every order he gave, every distance he kept, and every night he chose to rule from his fortress instead of standing among his men. The butcher had become the boss. The White House Don now sat on the throne of the most powerful family in America. But as the years ahead would prove, thrones built on fractured loyalty rarely last. And in the shadows of his own family, the seeds of betrayal had already been planted. The tension didn't erupt all at once. It crept in slowly, like a crack forming in the foundation of a house, barely noticeable at first, then widening with every passing day until the entire structure threatened to collapse. By the late 1970s, the Gambino family wasn't one family at all. It was two worlds held together by thin threads: the street soldiers who lived for the old ways, and the white-collar crew who followed Paul Castellano into a new era of boardroom crime. Between those two worlds stood Aniello Delacroix, the underboss, whose loyalty kept the fragile peace. The split was visible everywhere. In the smoky backrooms of Little Italy, soldiers traded stories of hijackings, card games, and late-night shootings. They wore their scars like medals, proud of the dirt under their fingernails, proud of the fear they could command just by walking into a bar. These were the men who believed the Mafia's soul was in the streets. They called themselves blue-collar, not out of shame, but out of pride. They were the backbone, the muscle, the enforcers who believed respect was earned one bloody knuckle at a time. And then there was Castellano's camp. They met in polished offices and upscale restaurants, talking not about brawls or beatings, but about contracts, labor deals, and percentages. To them, the future of the family wasn't in dice games and jukebox money. It was in unions, construction, and the kind of corporate infiltration that turned billions into rivers of cash. They wore suits, not leather jackets. They signed deals, not vendettas. They believed that if the Mafia was going to survive, it had to evolve. At first, it seemed like there was room for both. Castellano had the numbers to prove his vision worked. The family's wealth was growing at unprecedented levels. But money didn't erase pride. For the blue-collar soldiers, every dollar Castellano counted from his mansion was a reminder of how far he had drifted from them. He was their boss, yes, but he didn't share their lives. He didn't sit at their tables in the rave night social club. He didn't stand shoulder to shoulder with them on the streets. He was untouchable, and in the Mafia, untouchable wasn't always a compliment. Delacroix became the bridge. He told his men to accept Castellano, to swallow their anger and honor Gambino's final decision. Outwardly, he respected Paul's authority, but privately, he felt the strain. He had built his life on loyalty to soldiers, on the sweat and blood of the streets. Now, he was forced to defend a boss who ruled from behind iron gates, a boss who saw soldiers less as brothers and more as employees. Delacroix's men followed his word, but their resentment simmered just beneath the surface. The contrast between the two factions wasn't just style, it was philosophy. Castellano believed fear attracted attention, and attention brought indictments. He wanted to bury violence beneath a veneer of legitimacy, to make the family look less like a criminal enterprise and more like a corporation. The blue-collar faction believed violence was the language of power. To them, a boss who didn't stand on the street wasn't a boss at all. Meetings grew tense. When Castellano demanded tighter rules on drug trafficking, forbidding soldiers from dealing because it brought too much heat, Delacroix's men bristled. Drugs were fast money, and many were already deeply involved. To them, Castellano's ban was less about caution and more about control. They saw it as a boss dictating from a mansion while cutting off their lifelines. Paul didn't care about their protests. In his mind, drugs were poison, not for moral reasons. but because they drew the full wrath of federal investigators. He believed the family's future was safer in construction and unions, not heroin. But by forbidding it outright, he deepened the divide. Men who risked prison to smuggle and sell felt betrayed by a leader who didn't understand the reality of the street. Every choice Castellano made widened the gulf. When he summoned capos to his mansion for meetings, they sat stiffly in his ornate dining room, surrounded by marble and chandeliers, listening as he spoke like a CEO addressing shareholders. Some nodded respectfully, but others bit their tongues, seething at the arrogance of a boss who ruled like a king from a fortress. They longed for leaders like Delacroce, who smoked with them, drank with them, and remembered their names without needing a ledger. The resentment wasn't only emotional. It was practical. Soldiers saw themselves working jobs that carried enormous risk, hijackings, extortion, and the occasional murder, while Castellano's inner circle reaped millions from deals that required no blood, no danger, just contracts and handshakes. The split wasn't just about identity. It was about who got the better end of the bargain. For Castellano, the divide was invisible at first, or at least unimportant. He believed money would keep men loyal. He believed the sheer size of his empire would silence the grumbling. But loyalty in the Mafia wasn't only bought with money. It was built through presence, through respect, through a boss's willingness to show he lived by the same code as his men. Castellano couldn't see that. To him, distance was safety. To his soldiers, distance was betrayal. Delacroce kept the peace as best he could. His presence reassured the blue-collar soldiers, convincing them to stay in line, to accept Castellano's rule. Without Delacroce, the split might have erupted into outright war. With him, it stayed contained, like a fire smoldering quietly under the floorboards. But even Delacroce knew it couldn't last forever. He was aging, his health weakening, and the question of what would happen after him loomed larger with every passing year. The FBI noticed the fracture, too. Investigators began mapping out the factions, noting which soldiers leaned toward Delacroce and which aligned with Castellano. They knew division could be exploited. They knew that the stronger the resentment grew, the easier it would be for someone inside to turn. And in the world of organized crime, betrayal was always just one whispered promise away. The image of the Gambino family as a monolith was crumbling. To the outside world, it still looked like a powerhouse, raking in millions, its boss seated in a mansion that symbolized untouchable wealth. But inside, loyalty was wearing thin. Castellano's boardroom style clashed with the street's expectations, and Delacroce's quiet authority could only hold the line for so long. For Paul, the White House mansion was a fortress. For his men, it was a prison wall that kept their boss locked away from them. He believed he was building a future. They believed he was abandoning the past. And as the years passed, the question grew sharper, whispered in bars and backrooms across the city. When Aniello Delacroce was gone, who would hold the family together? The answer, though still hidden in the shadows, was already forming. And it would bring the greatest test of Castellano's reign, one that would decide whether his vision of a mafia boardroom could survive the fury of the streets waiting outside his gates. In the late 1970s, a soldier in the Gambino family told a story that spread quickly through the ranks. He had worked a job, taken risks, and delivered the money upward. He expected to hand it over to the boss himself, to shake his hand and exchange a word of respect. Instead, he was waved toward an associate, instructed to leave the envelope at the door. Paul Castellano was inside his mansion, but the soldier never saw him. That absence became the story. A boss who ruled from a distance, a don in suits, not streets. Paul believed this was how power should look. In his eyes, a boss didn't need to walk among soldiers to prove himself. A boss should be above the dirt, like a corporate executive who never goes down to the factory floor. He wore finely tailored suits, spoke in measured tones, and spent more time at polished dining tables than in smoky backrooms. He was a businessman first, gangster second, and he carried himself as if the two were no longer separate but identical. To outsiders, this made him seem untouchable. He was rarely seen in the clubs or bars where most mafia leaders mingled. He avoided the kind of places where law enforcement could photograph him with associates. Instead, he lived in his Staten Island palace, summoning men when he wanted them, and letting silence speak for him when he didn't. The White House mansion became the stage for his leadership, its marble floors and chandeliers reflecting the image he wanted the world to see, a Don elevated above the chaos of the streets. But inside his own family, that distance carried a price. Soldiers respected the money he generated, the empire he expanded, but they resented the wall he built between himself and them. They were used to bosses who lived among them, who showed their faces in the neighborhood, who shared the risks of the street. Castellano didn't. He ruled by reports, by numbers, by layers of trusted intermediaries who shielded him from the men at the bottom. To them, he wasn't a father figure. He was a landlord collecting rent. The difference in style was stark. When soldiers gathered at the Rave Night Social Club, they saw Delacroix, the underboss, sitting with them, smoking, laughing, listening. Delacroix's presence reminded them of the old ways, of a boss who was one of them, even as he outranked them. Castellano, by contrast, seemed more like a ghost. They spoke of him, sent him their money, followed his rules, but rarely stood in his presence. That absence gnawed at them, creating a rift that money alone couldn't close. Paul, however, believed he was protecting himself. He had seen what happened to bosses who spent too much time in the open, who made themselves too available. They were photographed, wiretapped, arrested, betrayed. By keeping his distance, he thought he was insulating himself from risk. To him, being inaccessible wasn't arrogance, it was strategy. But perception is everything, and the men under him didn't see strategy. They saw detachment. They saw a man who no longer understood their lives. His leadership style mirrored that of a CEO, demanding efficiency and loyalty, but offering little warmth in return. He was meticulous about money, demanding exact reports, expecting profits to flow upward without delay or excuse. He held his capos accountable the way a businessman held executives accountable, and he expected the chain of command to remain unbroken. Soldiers rarely had his ear directly. Their concerns had to climb the ladder before they reached him. That distance created bureaucracy in a world built on blood loyalty. The irony was that Paul thought he was elevating the family. He wanted the Gambinos to look less like a gang and more like a corporation, with himself at the top as a dignified patriarch. But in doing so, he eroded the very fabric that bound the Mafia together. In a world where respect was often measured by a handshake or a personal word, Castellano replaced it with memos delivered through his captains. It wasn't that he lacked intelligence. On the contrary, he was calculating, shrewd, and capable of seeing opportunities others missed. He built industries, manipulated unions, and made millions from businesses that looked legitimate on the surface. His vision of power was broader than the street-level minds of many of his men. But vision without connection can breed contempt, and contempt in the Mafia is deadly. Stories spread of how little time Paul spent with the rank and file. Soldiers joked that seeing him was like spotting a celebrity, rare, distant, and never intimate. They nicknamed him behind closed doors, mocking his obsession with business and his avoidance of the old rituals of leadership. They didn't deny his wealth, but they doubted his heart. To them, he wasn't living the life. He was hiding from it. This wasn't just about pride. It was about survival. Soldiers who risked prison or death on the streets wanted assurance that their boss valued them. They wanted to feel that their sacrifices mattered, that their loyalty was recognized. Castellano, intentionally or not, made them feel disposable, as if their only worth was measured in dollars. In a culture built on the idea of family, this cold detachment was corrosive. The FBI noticed the same thing. Agents tailing Castellano noted how rarely he ventured into public spaces with his soldiers. They realized that while his insulation made him harder to catch on traditional charges, it also created enemies within his own family. They understood that resentment was as dangerous to him as surveillance. In their reports, they described him as a boss who was respected for his power but unloved for his distance. Even within his inner circle, his leadership style created unease. Capos admired his discipline but feared his lack of warmth. They knew he could turn on them in an instant if numbers fell short or if whispers of disloyalty reached his ears. Loyalty was expected without question, but rarely reciprocated in a way that men could feel. Castellano saw himself as a businessman above sentiment, but his men saw only coldness. The gulf widened with every year. The blue-collar faction, loyal to Delacroce, saw Castellano's distance as proof that he wasn't a true boss. They whispered that he was more accountant than Don, more landlord than leader. They still sent him money, still obeyed his rules, but their loyalty was brittle, held together more by tradition than by faith. For Paul, the suits became armor. The boardroom style became his shield. He believed he was reinventing the Mafia for a new age, one where wealth and respectability would shield them from the relentless gaze of law enforcement. But the men beneath him didn't want reinvention. They wanted recognition. And Castellano didn't see how deeply that hunger was eroding the ground beneath his feet. He had become the Don in suits, not streets. A boss who measured success in profits instead of loyalty, who spoke in business terms instead of the language of the streets. It worked for a time. The money flowed. The empire expanded. The family grew richer than ever. But beneath the marble floors of his mansion, beneath the tailored suits and polished shoes, danger was waiting. Because in the Mafia, money could buy influence, but it could never buy love. And when love was absent, betrayal was always near. As Paul Castellano tightened his grip on the family from his White House fortress, the men in the streets tightened their fists in silence. They smiled in his presence, but their whispers grew louder in the dark corners of New York. And though he didn't know it yet, those whispers would one day carry the weight of bullets. In the heart of New York City, steel beams clawed at the sky. Skyscrapers rose like monuments. Bridges stretched across rivers, and sidewalks poured endlessly in gray rivers of cement. But what the public never saw was that every ounce of concrete flowing into the city had an invisible signature stamped on it. Behind the noise of jackhammers and the grind of bulldozers, there was a different kind of construction underway, an empire built not with blueprints and permits, but with fear, favors, and secret handshakes. At the center of it all sat Paul Castellano. The concrete club, as it would come to be known, was one of his most lucrative inventions. On paper, it looked like ordinary business. Construction companies bid on projects, concrete suppliers filled orders, and unions provided workers. But in reality, it was a rigged game, and Castellano was the referee. Only certain suppliers were allowed to provide concrete for projects over $2 million, and all of them had one thing in common. They were tied to the Gambino family. If a company wanted to play in New York, it had to pay the toll. The brilliance of it was in its simplicity. Concrete was the foundation of everything in the city. Without it, buildings stalled, roads cracked, and bridges stood unfinished. Control the supply, and you controlled the very pace of progress. It wasn't just extortion, it was ownership. Castellano understood this better than anyone. He had turned something as ordinary as cement into one of the most valuable rackets the Mafia had ever seen. The secret meetings that made it all possible rarely took place in smoky backrooms. They were quiet affairs, tucked away in private rooms of steakhouses or behind the closed doors of his Staten Island mansion. Builders, union leaders, and mob representatives sat together, talking not in threats, but in percentages. Castellano would listen carefully, nodding as deals were laid out, his hands folded neatly on the table like a banker hearing a loan request. For the men across from him, the message was unspoken but undeniable. Play by his rules, and your projects would move forward smoothly. Refuse, and concrete would stop flowing like a dammed river. Developers quickly learned the cost of saying no. Trucks would fail to arrive, permits would be delayed, picket lines would appear overnight. Construction workers would suddenly walk off sites, leaving millions of dollars in equipment idle. It was pressure applied with surgical precision, and it almost never required violence. The threat was enough. And when the phone finally rang offering a solution, every developer knew it was easier to pay Castellano's price than to fight him. For Paul, it was the perfect racket. Violence brought police. Paperwork rarely did. By burying his control inside contracts, unions, and suppliers, he made the Mafia's hand almost invisible. The money came in clean, filtered through legitimate businesses, and by the time it reached him, it looked like nothing more than profit from a successful company. To outsiders, it was business as usual. To those inside, it was tribute to the Don. The Concrete Club didn't just enrich him, it elevated his reputation. Other families envied his system, admiring how he had turned something so ordinary into a gold mine. To his allies, it proved that Castellano wasn't just another gangster. He was a visionary. He had seen opportunity in cement where others saw only sidewalks. That reputation earned him the nickname, the Howard Hughes of the mob, a businessman disguised as a boss, or perhaps a boss disguised as a businessman. But even the most brilliant schemes breed resentment. The blue-collar faction of his family, already frustrated with his distance, saw the Concrete Club as another symbol of his detachment. They risked prison and bullets on the street, while Castellano sat in his mansion, hosting builders and counting millions. To them, it felt like a betrayal of what the Mafia was supposed to be, men standing shoulder to shoulder, sharing risk as well as reward. Castellano saw himself as protecting the family by steering them away from dangerous rackets like drugs. His men saw him protecting only himself, leaving them scraps while he feasted on contracts. The FBI began to take notice, too. Investigators digging into New York's construction industry found patterns that were too neat to be coincidence. The same suppliers winning the same bids, the same unions enforcing the same deals. Hidden surveillance picked up whispers of meetings, and slowly, the threads began to reveal a web stretching across the city. To the Bureau, it was clear. Castellano had turned New York's skyline into his personal cash register. Every new tower rising above Manhattan was another entry in his ledger. Inside the Gambino family, Castellano defended the system fiercely. He argued that the money was safer, cleaner, and longer-lasting than any other racket. Why hijack a truck for a quick score when you could skim millions from construction companies year after year? Why risk a murder indictment when you could control industries without firing a single shot? In his mind, this was progress. This was evolution. He was dragging the Mafia into the future, whether his men wanted it or not. But every evolution leaves someone behind. The men on the street didn't feel the future. They felt distance, neglect, and the weight of a boss who seemed more like a landlord than a leader. Castellano's vision might have been brilliant, but it didn't touch the lives of the men who carried the guns and collected the envelopes. To them, the Concrete Club wasn't a family achievement. It was Castellano's achievement, built on their loyalty but not shared equally. The rift deepened, even as the money poured in. Castellano's empire grew stronger, but his foundation, his men, grew weaker in loyalty. It was the paradox of his reign. The more successful he became in business, the more disconnected he became from the soldiers who kept him in power. The Concrete Club made Paul Castellano one of the richest bosses in Mafia history. It also made him one of the most resented. Developers feared him, businessmen tolerated him, but his own soldiers questioned him. He had mastered the art of making the city itself his hostage. But in doing so, he had overlooked the most dangerous threat of all, the quiet anger of the men standing in his shadow. And as the skyscrapers of New York climbed higher, fueled by concrete he controlled, whispers in the dark grew louder. Whispers that no amount of money, no matter how clean or clever, could silence forever. The Concrete Club had given Castellano the image of invincibility. But beneath that polished surface, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that no cement could ever fill. It was almost poetic that Paul Castellano, the butcher's son who once carried the smell of raw meat on his clothes, would later carve out one of his most profitable rackets in the very same trade. For him, the meat business wasn't just a reminder of where he came from. It was an industry he knew inside and out, an industry he could bend to his will. And in the world of organized crime, familiarity was power. By the late 1970s, Castellano had already built his empire through unions, construction, and concrete. But the meat industry was different. It was personal. He understood how the trucks moved, how the supply chains worked, how buyers and sellers haggled over prices. He had spent his youth weighing cuts behind a counter, watching customers count pennies. Now, With soldiers and unions at his disposal, he could flip that knowledge into something far larger. The scheme was simple in principle, devastating in execution. Castellano and his associates fixed prices across the wholesale meat industry. Companies that refused to play along found themselves locked out, their deliveries hijacked or delayed until they had no choice but to bend. Trucks carrying sides of beef would mysteriously vanish on the road, only to reappear stripped clean, their cargo sold elsewhere for profit. It wasn't random theft. It was control. Castellano had taken his butcher's eye for cuts and turned it into a racket that bled money from the very arteries of New York's food supply. For small butchers and grocery owners across the city, the effect was suffocating. They had to pay inflated prices, knowing full well the shadowy hand behind it. They saw the meat arrive late, sometimes spoiled, sometimes half of what they ordered. They grumbled, but they paid, because the alternative was worse. Refuse, and you risked more than empty shelves. You risked broken windows, missing deliveries, or worse. The hijackings themselves carried a certain dark choreography. A truck would roll out of a warehouse in the early morning, loaded with thousands of pounds of beef or poultry. Hours later, it would be pulled off the road by masked men who knew exactly where to strike and how to unload fast. By the time police caught wind, the meat had already been redistributed through Castellano's network of contacts. It was theft disguised as business, and business disguised as theft. Paul treated the racket less like a gangster and more like a businessman tightening his grip on a monopoly. He set the rules, fixed the prices, and demanded his cut. His men enforced those rules with the kind of precision that left little room for resistance. It wasn't just about stealing trucks. It was about creating a system where no one in the meat trade could make a move without him noticing. The FBI would later describe the racket as an invisible tax. Every piece of meat sold in New York carried a little extra cost, and that cost flowed upward to Castellano. Customers buying dinner in grocery stores never knew it, but their money was feeding the empire of the White House Don. For Castellano, the meat connection was a symbol of how far he had come. He wasn't hijacking trucks himself. He wasn't leaning over a butcher's block. He was orchestrating an industry-wide racket from the comfort of his mansion, using the same instincts he had learned as a boy in Brooklyn. He had turned his past into profit, reshaping the butcher's apron into a crown. But once again, the success came at a price inside his own family. Soldiers resented the way Castellano poured his energy into white-collar rackets like the meat industry. While distancing himself from the street work they still risked their lives for. They saw the hijackings not as shared ventures, but as just another way Castellano enriched himself. He rarely touched the danger, but he collected the reward. To them, the butcher's son had forgotten the butcher's life. This resentment deepened as Castellano tightened his rules. He wanted order, efficiency, and total obedience. To him, discipline was the lifeblood of success. But to the soldiers, it felt like chains. They whispered that he was no longer one of them, that he was more CEO than Don. And every envelope of money they handed over, every risk they took, only fueled that quiet anger. Law enforcement, too, began to see the meat connection as a way to pierce his armor. Investigators followed the trucks, tracked the hijackings, and pieced together how Castellano's reach extended into food markets across the city. Unlike street crime, the meat racket left paper trails, shipping manifests, invoices, union records. Each one was a breadcrumb leading back to his empire. The FBI didn't yet have the full picture, but they saw enough to know that Castellano wasn't just running a crime family. He was running a shadow economy. Paul, however, believed he was untouchable. He saw the meat business as his masterpiece, a symbol of how the Mafia could evolve beyond crude violence into something more sustainable. He believed he had transformed extortion into commerce, theft into strategy. In his mind, it was proof that he was smarter than the men who came before him, smarter than the cops who chased him, smarter even than the soldiers who grumbled about his distance. And yet, the irony was hard to ignore. The butcher's boy who once dropped out of school to carve meat in Brooklyn now ruled an empire that bled millions from the very same industry. The apron had been traded for suits, the knife for contracts, but the essence was the same. He was still cutting meat. Only now, the cuts were measured in millions of dollars. But history has a cruel sense of balance. The very skills that made Castellano powerful also made him vulnerable. His obsession with business, his distance from the streets, his reliance on white-collar rackets. They built his empire, yes, but they also widened the cracks inside it. His soldiers didn't want a butcher-turned-businessman. They wanted a boss who stood with them, not above them. The meat connection filled his pockets, but it emptied his reservoir of loyalty. And in the Mafia, loyalty was worth more than money. Without it, all the wealth in the world couldn't save you. As the trucks rolled on, as unions fell deeper under his sway, as his mansion filled with riches carved from the lifeblood of New York's food supply, Paul Castellano believed he was unbreakable. But in the shadows of his own family, men whispered about betrayal. And for the first time, the butcher's empire began to carry the faint scent of blood, not from the meat he sold, but from the danger waiting just beyond his gates. The night Paul Castellano was crowned boss of the Gambino family, one man in particular carried a storm behind his eyes. Aniello Delacroce, the underboss, sat silently while the decision was announced. Outwardly, he accepted it. He nodded, he offered his loyalty, and he told his men to do the same. But inside, in the quiet corners of his mind, the wound cut deep. For years, he had been Carlo Gambino's right hand. He had held the family together, kept the soldiers in line, bled loyalty when others betrayed it. And yet, when the time came, Carlo had chosen not him but Castellano, the businessman who lived in a mansion far from the streets. That moment became a fracture line that would define the Gambino family for years. On one side stood Castellano, the White House Don, obsessed with boardroom rackets and corporate control. On the other stood Delacroce, the street general, the man whose presence alone commanded loyalty among soldiers hardened by blood and prison cells. He remained the underboss, yes, but the title carried less weight than the respect his men gave him freely. Delacroce was everything Castellano wasn't. Where Paul hid behind marble walls, Delacroce was at the rave night social club, surrounded by soldiers who trusted him. He smoked with them, laughed with them, listened to their complaints. He shared their lives, their risks, their frustrations. To the street faction, Delacroce wasn't just an underboss. He was the real heart of the family, the bridge between their blood and the power above. This balance kept the family from splintering outright. Delacroce never openly defied Castellano. He told his men that Carlo Gambino's word was law, even from the grave, and that to go against Castellano would dishonor the family. But those words were more shield than conviction. Delacroce knew his men were restless. He knew they whispered about Paul's arrogance, his distance, his obsession with business that left them feeling abandoned. Delacroce's acceptance was the only thread holding back their resentment from boiling into rebellion. That resentment grew every time Castellano called a meeting at his Staten Island mansion. Soldiers would sit stiffly in his ornate dining room, uncomfortable in suits they could barely afford, listening to Castellano lecture about efficiency, profit, and discipline. They would return to the rave night afterward, grumbling to Delacroce about how out of touch their boss was. Delacroce would calm them, reassure them, remind them that patience was survival. But in his heart, he shared some of their doubts. The FBI saw the divide and understood its danger. To them, Castellano represented the future of organized crime, cleaner, quieter, harder to prosecute. Delacroce represented the old world, the blood-soaked streets where loyalty was earned with scars. Investigators wrote reports describing the Gambino family not as one entity, but as two, connected by nothing more than tradition and the fragile loyalty Delacroce enforced. They knew the split could be exploited. They knew it was only a matter of time before it cracked open. Delacroce himself lived with the weight of contradiction. He was loyal to the family, but loyalty meant obeying a boss he didn't fully respect. He was loyal to his men, but loyalty meant keeping them from openly challenging Castellano. Every day was a balancing act, one misstep away from disaster. He carried himself with quiet authority, but inside he wrestled with the same frustration his men voiced out loud. He had been passed over. He had been told, in no uncertain terms, that his kind of leadership belonged to the past. To the blue-collar faction, this was more than personal. It was cultural. They believed Castellano looked down on them, saw them as crude laborers compared to his polished world of contracts and corporations. They felt like employees, not brothers. Delacroce became their anchor, the man who reminded them that the old ways still mattered, that their lives and sacrifices still carried weight. Paul, from his mansion, underestimated the depth of this divide. He believed Delacroce's loyalty was enough to keep the streets in line. He saw the money flowing upward and assumed it meant contentment. He thought his rules, his vision, his obsession with business would eventually be accepted as progress. He didn't see the anger simmering just beneath the surface, anger that Delacroce could barely contain. The irony was that Delacroce never openly sought to overthrow Castellano. He wasn't a man consumed by ambition for the throne. What he wanted was respect, recognition for the years he had given, the loyalty he had lived by. What his men wanted was a boss who stood with them, not above them. Castellano gave them neither, and Delacroce, bound by the code, kept telling them to endure. But patience has a limit. With every passing year, with every new scheme in construction or meat or unions that seemed to benefit Castellano more than the soldiers, the resentment grew heavier. Men began to whisper not just in private but openly in backrooms, asking what would happen when Delacroce was gone. Who would speak for them then? Who would stand between them and a boss who saw them as disposable? Delacroce's presence alone delayed the inevitable. His name carried too much weight for men to act against Castellano while he lived. But time was catching up to him. His health began to decline. His face grew thinner. His voice rasped with illness. Everyone could see it. And with every cough, with every whispered report of his failing health, the question loomed larger. When Aniello Delacroce was gone, who would hold the family together? Castellano believed his wealth, his mansion, his boardroom leadership would carry him through. He believed respect could be replaced with fear and loyalty replaced with money. He didn't see that the streets still belonged to Delacroce, and that once Delacroce's steady hand was gone, the fragile balance would collapse. In the Mafia, power was never just about who sat on the throne. It was about who men believed in, who they would kill for, who they would die for. Castellano had the throne. Delacroce had the faith of the streets. And as Delacroce's health declined, the whispers grew louder. Whispers of change. Whispers of betrayal. Whispers that one day soon, the streets would no longer be held back by the man they called their underboss. Paul Castellano could not hear those whispers from behind the walls of his White House. But they were there, carried on the smoke-filled air of the rave night, waiting for the moment when patience turned into fury. And when that moment came, the White House Don would find himself surrounded not by loyalty, but by shadows sharpening into knives. The walls of Paul Castellano's Staten Island mansion were meant to protect him. They were high, secure, fitted with cameras and gates. To him, the White House was a fortress, a place where he could conduct business without fear of intruders. But what Castellano didn't know was that the real enemy didn't come through the front door or over the fence. It came in through the wiring. Hidden in the walls of his own home, the FBI had planted ears, bugs that would capture the most intimate details of his life, the kinds of details that could undo him more effectively than any bullet. The agents called it the home run. After months of planning, surveillance, and careful infiltration, they had managed to install microphones inside Castellano's palace. It was a dangerous gamble. If they were caught, the consequences wouldn't just be legal, they could be fatal. But the risk paid off. Suddenly, the FBI wasn't just watching Castellano from the outside. They were inside his home, listening to every conversation, every sigh, every slip of the tongue. What they heard stunned them. Castellano, who had cultivated the image of a businessman Don, revealed himself as something far more traditional and far more dangerous. The bugs picked up discussions of money, rackets, and orders that hinted at murder. It wasn't just corporate talk. It was the language of the Mafia, stripped bare of its disguises. And the FBI wrote it all down, building a case word by word, sentence by sentence. But the recordings revealed more than business. They revealed the private life Castellano had worked so hard to keep hidden. Among the most explosive discoveries was his affair with his maid, a woman who worked inside the mansion while his wife lived under the same roof. Castellano spoke of her openly, sometimes crudely, unaware that every word was being captured. For the agents, it was shocking not just because it exposed him, but because it revealed his arrogance. Here was a man so confident in his fortress that he didn't consider the possibility of invisible ears. The affair mattered because in the Mafia, appearances meant everything. A Don was supposed to represent discipline, control, respectability within the twisted code of Cosa Nostra. To be caught humiliating his wife, flaunting an affair in his own home, was dangerous. It chipped away at the aura of respect he so carefully cultivated. Soldiers who already resented his distance would now whisper about his hypocrisy. In a world where loyalty was currency, even personal shame could become a weapon. More damning still were the conversations about violence. Castellano, the man who often portrayed himself as above street bloodshed, was heard discussing hits. He weighed the cost of lives, decided who would live and who would die, as casually as a businessman weighing contracts. For the FBI, these recordings were gold. They weren't rumors or second-hand testimony. They were the boss's own words, captured in real time. Evidence like that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. The agents couldn't believe their luck. Every day, they sat with headphones on, listening to Castellano speak. They heard about his rackets in construction and meat, his rules against drug trafficking, his frustrations with his soldiers. They heard him laugh. They heard him curse. They heard him betray the image he had so carefully built. Each tape was another nail in the coffin. And the more they listened, the clearer it became that Castellano was not the untouchable businessman he wanted the world to see. He was still a gangster, bound by the same bloody codes as every other boss before him. Inside the mansion, Castellano carried on as though nothing had changed. He still believed in the illusion of safety. He still thought his walls kept him secure. He summoned capos, held dinners, whispered deals across his marble table. But the entire time, the FBI was there with him, invisible, recording every syllable. The fortress he trusted most had become the stage for his undoing. When the transcripts began to circulate in law enforcement circles, they caused a sensation. Prosecutors who had struggled for years to penetrate the inner workings of the Gambino family suddenly had the Don's own voice on tape. It was more than surveillance. It was confession. But the Bureau faced a choice: how much to reveal and when. Too soon, and Castellano might discover the bugs and shut them down. Too late, and the evidence could lose its impact in court. Timing was everything. For Castellano, the danger wasn't just legal. If the tapes became public, they wouldn't just embarrass him in the courtroom. They would humiliate him within the Mafia. The affair with his maid, the crude jokes, the candid frustrations with his own men. These details could destroy his standing as much as the revelations about murder and money. A Don needed respect more than he needed wealth. Without it, power crumbled. The irony was brutal. Castellano had built his life on distance, on creating an image of control and sophistication. He believed that by staying above the streets, by conducting business from his mansion, he could insulate himself from the dangers that had killed other bosses. But the very place he thought safest had betrayed him. His own voice, carried on hidden wires, became the weapon that would shatter his world. Meanwhile, his soldiers whispered about the recordings. Rumors leaked, half-truths spread, and resentment deepened. Men who already doubted Castellano's leadership now saw him as vulnerable. To them, the FBI wasn't just a threat to their boss. It was a sign that the fortress wasn't impenetrable, that the Don in suits wasn't untouchable after all. The cracks widened. Castellano still believed money and power would shield him. But his men were beginning to ask a dangerous question. If the boss could be brought down by his own words, how much longer could he truly lead? The tapes gave the FBI leverage. They gave Castellano's enemies hope. And they gave his soldiers one more reason to consider whether loyalty to the White House Don was worth the risk. In the end, the bugs were more dangerous than any assassin. They revealed not just what Paul Castellano did, but who he really was behind the walls of his palace. And in the Mafia, perception was everything. Once the perception of invincibility cracked, the man himself was already halfway to ruin. Paul Castellano had spent his life trying to rise above the blood-soaked streets. But now, in the quiet of his own mansion, with every word he spoke being captured by unseen ears, the truth became impossible to escape. And somewhere, beyond his gates, men were beginning to whisper that maybe the tapes were only the beginning. That maybe, the Don in suits would soon face a reckoning the walls of his fortress could never keep out. The news reached Paul Castellano not in a thunderclap, but in whispers. Some of his men, soldiers he had trusted to follow the code, were neck-deep in heroin. The drug, cheap to smuggle and worth more than gold once cut and bagged, was flooding New York. Addicts lined alleys, cops swarmed neighborhoods, and prosecutors sharpened their knives. Castellano had made his rule clear: no drugs. Not because he cared about the addicts wasting away in dark rooms, but because drugs brought heat. Heat meant indictments. Indictments meant betrayal. To him, heroin was a poison not just to the streets, but to the Mafia itself. But rules, in the Mafia, were like fences. They kept honest men in line, but ambitious men always found a way to climb over. The profits were too big. A single shipment of heroin could bring in millions, more than hijacking trucks or shaking down construction companies ever could. For soldiers living one step away from poverty, the temptation was irresistible. They didn't see heroin as a betrayal. They saw it as survival. The arrests came quickly. Newspapers splashed headlines about heroin busts tied to Gambino men. Detectives boasted of breaking open drug rings. And every time Castellano picked up a paper or heard another report, his paranoia deepened. Each arrest was more than a legal problem. It was a sign of weakness, a sign that his men weren't listening. Worse, it was a sign that the FBI might one day trace those deals all the way back to his White House mansion. Inside his home, Castellano raged. He saw himself as a businessman, a don elevated above street-level filth. To him, drugs were the opposite of sophistication. They were chaos, dirt, a stain on the empire he had built brick by brick. He didn't just fear prosecution. He feared humiliation. How could he hold meetings with union bosses and developers, speaking in percentages and contracts, if his soldiers were being dragged through courtrooms as drug dealers? It undermined the image he had worked so carefully to construct. But on the streets, the soldiers told a different story. They didn't care about image. They cared about envelopes. Heroin paid. It paid better than hijackings, better than gambling, better than anything else. And while Castellano sat in his marble mansion demanding obedience, they risked their lives day after day. They wanted their share, even if it meant breaking his rules. The tension grew like a crack in glass. Every arrest meant another round of questioning. Who knew what? Who talked? Who could be trusted? Castellano, already distant from his men, became more isolated. He suspected everyone. He demanded reports, grilled capos, and threatened punishment. But punishment only bred more resentment. Soldiers whispered that their boss didn't understand the streets anymore, that he was so far removed from reality he couldn't see what they were living through. For Castellano, drugs became more than a business issue. They became a test of loyalty. Any man caught in heroin wasn't just breaking rules. He was defying him personally. Castellano began to treat suspicion like guilt, and guilt like betrayal. The walls of his mansion, already bugged by the FBI, now echoed with paranoia. He spoke of men in tones of distrust, wondering aloud who might turn, who might be wearing wires, who might be talking to the feds. The irony was sharp. His distance from the streets meant he had less control, not more. His rules against heroin were clear, but his lack of presence made them hollow. Soldiers might obey a boss they feared face to face. They might obey a boss who drank with them, who bled with them. But Castellano wasn't that man. He was the boss behind gates, the don in suits. And distance doesn't command obedience. It breeds rebellion. The FBI, meanwhile, understood the opportunity. They knew drugs were the Mafia's Achilles heel. The profits were too tempting, the risks too high, the betrayals too frequent. Every heroin case was a chance to flip a soldier, to squeeze him for names, to push him toward cooperation. And the Bureau's agents knew that Castellano's paranoia would only drive wedges deeper. They didn't have to break the Gambino family from the outside. The drug problem was doing it from within. The street faction, loyal to Aniello Della Croce, saw the conflict as proof that Castellano was unfit to lead them. They were already resentful of his distance, his arrogance, his mansion. Now, his hardline stance against drugs, while men risked their lives to bring in money, was another insult. They didn't see heroin as a threat. They saw it as the future. And if Castellano couldn't accept that, maybe it was time for a boss who could. Castellano tightened the leash. He ordered punishments for anyone caught in drug rackets. Some men disappeared. Others were beaten or stripped of their positions. The message was clear: break my rule, and you break your life. But fear is a brittle kind of loyalty. It lasts until resentment grows stronger. And resentment, in the Gambino family, was already bubbling like a pot ready to boil. At the same time, Castellano's obsession with control made him careless. He spoke too freely in his own home, believing he was safe, not realizing the FBI was listening. The bugs recorded him discussing drug cases, weighing punishments, admitting his distrust. Each word became evidence, a dagger the Bureau sharpened slowly, waiting for the right moment to strike. For the soldiers, the paranoia spread downward. They knew their boss didn't trust them. They knew he was watching, waiting for excuses to cut them loose. And so they began to whisper in corners, not about the feds, but about their own Don. They wondered if his paranoia was worse than the FBI itself. They wondered if their loyalty to Castellano was worth the risk. The drug problem was more than heroin on the streets. It was a disease eating at the core of the Gambino family. Castellano wanted control, but his men wanted freedom. Castellano wanted sophistication, but his men wanted money. And between those two desires lay a fault line that no amount of rules could fix. The fortress of the White House was no longer protection. It was a cage, trapping Castellano in paranoia while his men grew restless outside. And the FBI, listening in the walls, knew exactly how deep the cracks were running. Paul Castellano had built an empire on silence, loyalty, and control. But heroin was louder than silence, more tempting than loyalty, and stronger than control. It seeped through the cracks of his family like blood through bandages. And as arrests piled up, as whispers grew darker, as paranoia tightened its grip on him, one question haunted every corner of his mansion. How long could the White House Don hold power when even his own men were no longer listening? The answer was already forming in the streets, whispered in backrooms, plotted in shadows. And it would come not from the FBI's tapes, not from the courtroom, but from the men who once called him boss. The White House on Staten Island was supposed to be a symbol of triumph, a fortress where Paul Castellano could rule his empire in safety, away from the noise of the city. But inside those walls, a different story unfolded, one of betrayal, humiliation, and secrets that cut closer than any federal indictment. For all the money and power Castellano commanded, his personal life was tangled in drama that weakened him from within. The affair began quietly. His maid, a woman who worked in his home and lived under his roof, became more than just an employee. At first, it was whispered about in hushed tones among the household staff. Then, it became impossible to hide. Paul paraded her openly, treating her less like a servant and more like a mistress. And the scandal wasn't contained within the walls of the White House. Word spread. In a world built on codes of loyalty, honor, and appearances, Castellano's indulgence was seen as reckless. For his wife, it was a humiliation played out in plain sight. She still lived in the same mansion, walking the same halls as the woman her husband had taken as his lover. The insult was unbearable. Family gatherings grew tense, meals turned silent, and the whispers of relatives carried through the air like daggers. His children, too, were caught in the storm, torn between loyalty to their father and shame over his choices. Castellano might have been the boss of the Gambino family, but within his own home, he was presiding over a household fractured by betrayal. The FBI bugs hidden in the mansion only made matters worse. Agents listening in couldn't believe their luck. They captured not only conversations about business and rackets, but also intimate, unguarded remarks about his affair. His arrogance dripped through the recordings, his disregard for his wife, his casual treatment of his mistress. To prosecutors, it was evidence of character. To Castellano's men, when the transcripts eventually reached the streets, it was proof that their boss was not the dignified figure he pretended to be. He had become a man led by desire rather than discipline. For a mafia don, image was everything. Respect was currency. Castellano had built his authority on being seen as untouchable, above the filth of the street and the weakness of ordinary men. But the affair stripped that illusion away. Soldiers whispered that if he couldn't control his own household, how could he control the family? They mocked him in backrooms, calling him distracted, too consumed with his mistress to lead. In their eyes, the White House was no longer a fortress. It was a gilded cage where their boss was ruled not by power, but by lust. The family disputes only fueled the fire. Castellano's children resented the way he flaunted his mistress, the way he embarrassed their mother. Relatives whispered about betrayal, loyalty, and whether the Don had lost his grip not just on his empire, but on himself. At family dinners, old wounds surfaced, arguments over money, inheritance, and control of businesses. Every gesture, every word became a reminder that wealth did not buy harmony. In some ways, the White House was less a home than a battlefield. Castellano, for his part, seemed blind to the damage. He carried himself with the same air of authority, believing that his wealth and position excused his behavior. He had lived his entire life making rules for others, enforcing silence and loyalty. Now, within his own home, he believed those rules didn't apply to him. He was the Don. He could do as he pleased. But arrogance is often a mask for weakness, and in those moments, Castellano was more vulnerable than he realized. The FBI seized on it. They knew that a man's private life could be just as damaging as his business dealings. The affair humanized him in the worst way. It made him look careless, indulgent, hypocritical. To the public, it was scandal. To his men, it was a loss of respect. To the law, it was one more reason to paint him as unfit, corrupt, and guilty. Every transcript they released chipped away at his reputation. Every whisper from the tapes became another crack in his armor. Within the Mafia itself, the affair was more than embarrassing. It was dangerous. A Don was supposed to embody control. To lose control of his own household was to lose face in front of his men. And in the Mafia, once respect is gone, authority soon follows. Castellano's enemies within the family saw opportunity in his weakness. They pointed to his personal drama as proof that he was no longer fit to lead, that the man who claimed to be a businessman first and gangster second was failing at both. The mistress herself became a symbol. To some, she represented Castellano's arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable, even in matters of the heart. To others, she was simply proof that the Don's priorities were shifting away from the family and toward himself. Either way, her presence in the mansion fed resentment like fuel to a fire. Soldiers asked quietly why they should risk prison and death while their boss lived in luxury, distracted by personal indulgences. Every empire falls for different reasons. Some are crushed by outside enemies. Some collapse under financial strain. For Castellano, one of the cracks that would ultimately doom him began inside his own walls. The family drama, the affair, the disrespect, it all chipped away at the foundation of loyalty that held the Gambino family together. His enemies didn't need to invent excuses to move against him. He was giving them reasons, one careless decision at a time. The irony was cruel. Paul Castellano had always prided himself on being different from other bosses. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't reckless, he wasn't consumed by street violence. He saw himself as a man of order, of discipline, of vision. But in his personal life, he revealed the opposite. He showed weakness, arrogance, and indulgence. And those were the very traits his enemies would seize upon. As the mistress continued to live in the mansion, as his wife endured humiliation, as his children grew bitter, Castellano's empire grew rich, but his household grew poisonous. The Don who ruled the Gambino family with silence and distance could not silence the whispers inside his own home. And as the FBI listened in, capturing every detail, every sigh, every careless word, the White House on Staten Island no longer looked like a fortress. It looked like a house of cards. Soon, the drama within his own family would spill into the wider family he claimed to control. And when it did, the consequences would be far deadlier than embarrassment. Because in Cosa Nostra, a Don could survive the law, but he could never survive the loss of respect. By the early 1980s, Paul Castellano was no longer the man who walked the streets of Brooklyn with quiet confidence. He had withdrawn into his Staten Island palace, surrounded by marble, cameras, and iron gates. The White House, once a symbol of his triumph, began to feel less like a throne and more like a prison of his own design. He rarely left it. Meetings were held there, dinners hosted there, decisions made from behind its heavy doors. For Castellano, this was safety. For his soldiers, it was abandonment. The Gambino family had once seen him as a visionary, a businessman who could transform the Mafia into something greater than street rackets. But vision without presence breeds resentment. Soldiers who risked their lives hijacking trucks, extorting businesses, and running gambling operations began to feel neglected. They brought in the money, handed it upward, but the man at the top seemed uninterested in their lives. He didn't shake their hands in smoky bars. He didn't show up in their neighborhoods. He didn't share the same air. In the Mafia, presence was power. A boss's word carried weight not just because of the money behind it, but because men believed he stood with them, lived with them, shared the risks. Castellano broke that unspoken rule. His distance made him appear more like a corporate executive than a Don. Soldiers whispered that their boss didn't know them, didn't understand them, didn't care about them. Respect, the lifeblood of Cosa Nostra, began to drain away. Inside the mansion, Castellano was consumed by business. He pored over financial reports, union contracts, and construction deals, obsessing over details that made him richer but also more isolated. He still saw himself as untouchable, a man playing a longer game than the soldiers beneath him could understand. But in those long hours spent inside, he was blind to the reality outside his gates. His men weren't impressed by balance sheets. They were impressed by loyalty, by presence, by strength shown face to face. And Castellano was showing none of it. The resentment deepened with every passing year. The soldiers loyal to Aniello Della Croce, the underboss, grew especially restless. They were the blue-collar faction, the men who believed the Mafia was built in blood and sweat. To them, Castellano's absence was an insult. They respected Della Croce because he was with them, sitting in the Rave Night social club, listening to their complaints, sharing their struggles. But Castellano, their actual boss, might as well have been a stranger. The FBI noticed the shift, too. Surveillance agents observed how rarely Castellano left his estate. They saw soldiers going in and out, but the boss himself staying hidden. To them, it was evidence of paranoia, a man so consumed by fear of law enforcement and betrayal that he had trapped himself. They knew that isolation breeds weakness. A leader who doesn't connect with his men eventually loses them. Castellano's paranoia wasn't unfounded. The FBI had already bugged his home, capturing conversations that revealed his business dealings, his affairs, even his orders for violence. He knew he was under constant threat of indictment. To him, staying inside the mansion was survival. But to his men, it was cowardice. They didn't care about the reasons. They only cared about appearances. And the appearance was simple. Their boss was distant, distracted, and out of touch. The cracks widened further when Castellano enforced his ban on drug trafficking. He saw heroin as poison that would bring too much law enforcement heat. But many soldiers were already deep in it, making fortunes from the booming drug trade. When Castellano punished them, when he demanded obedience, they felt betrayed. It wasn't just about rules. It was about money. They risked everything, and their boss denied them the right to reap the rewards. To them, his ban wasn't wisdom. It was arrogance. The soldiers began to whisper openly about Castellano's failures. They said he cared more about his mistress than his family, more about his steak dinners than their sacrifices, more about his own image than their loyalty. They mocked him, calling him soft, calling him out of touch. And in the Mafia, mockery is more dangerous than defiance. It means respect is gone. Still, Castellano carried on as though nothing was wrong. He hosted dinners at the mansion, conducted business with contractors and union leaders, and convinced himself that his empire was secure. He believed money would keep his men loyal. He believed fear would keep them silent. But fear without respect is brittle, and money without loyalty is meaningless. His soldiers obeyed outwardly, but inwardly, they were already turning away. The decline of authority wasn't immediate. Castellano still had power, still controlled industries, still commanded wealth. But power in the Mafia isn't measured only in money. It's measured in the hearts of the men who serve you. And by the mid-1980s, Castellano's men no longer served with pride. They served with resentment, waiting for the chance to shift their loyalty elsewhere. The irony was that Castellano had always believed he was protecting the family. By staying inside, by banning drugs, by focusing on business, he thought he was shielding them from law enforcement and ensuring their survival. But the very steps he took to protect the family made him look weak, arrogant, and selfish. He thought he was building stability. In reality, he was building distance. That distance became a weapon in the hands of his rivals. Men in the street faction began to argue that Castellano no longer represented the family. They said he was only looking out for himself, that he had forgotten what it meant to be a boss. And with Delacroix's health declining, the question of succession loomed larger every day. The soldiers knew that when Delacroix was gone, there would be nothing left to hold them back. The White House mansion, once a fortress of power, became a symbol of decay. To his men, it wasn't a throne. It was a cage where their boss hid, a reminder of how far he had drifted from the code they lived by. To the FBI, it was a goldmine of evidence. To Castellano himself, it was safety. But in truth, it was isolation. And isolation, in the Mafia, is the beginning of the end. By the mid-1980s, Castellano was still the official boss of the Gambino family. But in the eyes of many soldiers, he was a ghost, powerful on paper, absent in reality. His authority was crumbling, his respect vanishing, his enemies growing bolder. And as whispers turned into plans, as resentment hardened into conspiracy, the White House Don was standing on a throne that was already beginning to crack beneath him. Soon, the streets would demand a different kind of leader, one who lived among them, one who understood them, one who didn't hide behind gates. And when that demand finally rose to the surface, Paul Castellano's distance would become his downfall. The knock came not with bullets, but with paper. Federal indictments, thick as phone books, heavy with years of investigation, landed on Paul Castellano's doorstep in the early 1980s. For a man who prided himself on living above the filth of the street, it was a humiliation sharper than any rival's betrayal. The White House Don, the businessman boss, was suddenly dragged into the harsh light of the courts. The charges were staggering. Racketeering under the RICO Act, tax fraud, conspiracy, even whispers of murder. Each accusation was like a brick stacked on his shoulders, proof that no matter how carefully he tried to disguise the Gambino family as a corporation, the government still saw it for what it was, organized crime. For Castellano, the indictment cut deeper than numbers on a page. It shattered his illusion of invulnerability. For years, he had believed that distance would protect him. Distance from the streets, distance from drugs, distance from the blood that soaked so many other bosses. He thought his polished image, his focus on business, his corporate disguises would shield him from the heat. But RICO was different. RICO wasn't about catching a man with a gun in his hand. It was about building a web so wide that even the men at the top could not escape it. The law treated him not as a businessman, but as the head of a criminal enterprise. And once prosecutors framed him that way, every contract, every union deal, every whispered conversation inside his mansion became part of the evidence. His fortress of wealth had turned into a glass house, every detail exposed to the glare of the law. When news of the indictments broke, his soldiers watched carefully. Some whispered with satisfaction, others with dread. To them, it wasn't just about the charges. It was about weakness. A boss under indictment was a boss under pressure. And in the Mafia, pressure invited betrayal. Men who once swore silence began to wonder if silence was still worth it. Every capo, every soldier questioned what the future held. Inside the White House, Castellano wrestled with the fear in his own way. Outwardly, he projected calm, insisting the government had nothing. He called the charges exaggerated, unfair, another attempt to paint him as something he wasn't. But behind closed doors, paranoia grew. He obsessed over who had talked, who might be wearing wires, who might have handed the government the keys to his empire. The FBI had built its case slowly, methodically. They followed the money, listened to the bugs in his mansion, tracked his union connections. They pieced together how the Gambino family had siphoned millions through the concrete business, the meat industry, and labor racketeering. To prosecutors, Castellano wasn't just guilty. He was the symbol of everything RICO had been designed to crush. For Castellano, the insult was almost worse than the charges. Tax fraud, conspiracy, paper crimes. To be painted as a mere crook fiddling with numbers offended the image he had built of himself. He wanted to be remembered as a man of vision, a builder of empires. Instead, he was reduced to an accused fraudster, dragged through the same courtrooms as common thieves. His lawyers fought hard, but the weight of the case was enormous. The transcripts from the bugs painted him as a man discussing murders, affairs, and money with shocking candor. Prosecutors didn't need to rely on unreliable witnesses. They had his own voice. For Castellano, who had always believed silence was safety, it was the cruelest irony of all. His fortress had betrayed him. Every word turned into evidence. As trial dates loomed, the cracks inside the family widened. Soldiers already resentful of Castellano's distance now saw him as vulnerable. They asked themselves dangerous questions. Could the boss survive this? If not, who would take his place? And perhaps most dangerous of all, was it worth staying loyal to a man whose empire seemed destined to fall? The indictments didn't just threaten Castellano with prison. They threatened his very authority. A Don's power rested on perception. If he looked strong, men followed him. If he looked weak, men betrayed him. And nothing made a boss look weaker than sitting in a courtroom, listening to prosecutors recite his sins. The government knew it, too. They weren't just prosecuting a case. They were striking at the heart of the Gambino family. By targeting Castellano, they hoped to shake the entire structure, to make soldiers doubt, to make rivals restless, to make the empire crack from within. And slowly it worked. In the streets, rival bosses watched with interest. Some smelled blood in the water, wondering if Castellano's downfall might shift the balance of power. Others feared the attention, knowing that if the government could bring down a boss like him, none of them were safe. Within his own family, whispers grew louder. Castellano still commanded wealth, still controlled industries, but the aura of invincibility was gone. At night, inside his mansion, Castellano sat with his mistress, reviewing documents, pacing floors, chain-smoking as he tried to convince himself he could outmaneuver the government. But the walls felt tighter, the shadows darker. Every car that passed, every unfamiliar face, every knock on the door carried suspicion. He had once ruled with distance, but now that distance felt like isolation. He was a man surrounded not by loyalty, but by silence. The indictments were more than charges. They were the beginning of the end. Castellano knew it, even if he wouldn't admit it. He had survived betrayals, survived law enforcement pressure before, but this was different. This was the government aiming not at his soldiers, not at his capos, but at him directly. And in the history of the Mafia, few bosses survived that kind of assault. Still, Castellano clung to power. He ordered his men to carry on, demanded loyalty, insisted the family remain united. But behind their respectful nods, soldiers whispered their doubts. They saw a boss who rarely left his mansion, now cornered by the government, now more vulnerable than ever. And as they whispered, some began to imagine a future without him. The empire Castellano had built over decades was beginning to crack. The wealth, the unions, the construction rackets, everything was still there, but the foundation was weakening. Respect was crumbling. Authority was fading. And in the Mafia, Once those things are gone, no amount of money can bring them back. The White House Don had always believed he could rule like a businessman, above the blood and chaos of the street. But now, the paper crimes of the courtroom threatened to bring him down more effectively than any bullet ever could. And as the trial dates approached, as the whispers grew louder, as his enemies sharpened their knives in the shadows, Castellano was left with a haunting question. Was the law going to bury him first? Or would betrayal beat them to it? The whispers began in corners, carried in low voices over glasses of whiskey in dim back rooms. They weren't shouts of rebellion yet, not open defiance, just murmurs. But in the Mafia, whispers are the first sparks of fire. Men who once spoke of their boss with reverence now spoke of him with contempt. Paul Castellano, they said, was weak. He was disconnected. He didn't respect them. And slowly, those whispers began to weave themselves into a dangerous narrative. Maybe it was time for a change. The street soldiers felt it most. They were the ones risking prison sentences and bullets, the ones pounding the pavement, while Castellano sat in his mansion surrounded by chandeliers and marble. To them, he wasn't a boss. He was an executive playing dress-up, a man who cared more about union contracts and steak dinners than about the men who carried envelopes of cash to his doorstep. He barely left Staten Island. He rarely showed his face in the clubs or the bars where soldiers lived their lives. Distance turned into resentment, and resentment turned into hatred. Castellano's rules didn't help. His ban on drug dealing cut deep into the pockets of soldiers who were already neck-deep in heroin. He thought he was protecting the family from heat. They thought he was strangling them. Each time one of them was arrested, each time their profits were seized, they looked at Castellano and saw not a leader protecting them, but a man cutting them off from survival. The gap between the suits and the streets widened, and no one could bridge it. In the Rave Night Social Club, where the air was thick with smoke and the weight of old traditions, loyalty still held, for a time. Aniello Delacroce kept his men in line, urging them to swallow their anger and follow Gambino's final wish. But Delacroce's health was failing. His face grew pale, his body frail. Everyone knew the inevitable was coming, and when he was gone, there would be no one left to restrain the anger of the streets. Into this vacuum stepped a new kind of figure. Younger, bolder, hungrier. A man who had lived the street life, who had served his prison time, who carried himself with swagger that soldiers admired. He wore his suits loud, drove Cadillacs that gleamed under streetlights, and smiled as if he had already written his destiny. To the blue-collar faction, he was everything Castellano wasn't. He was one of them, and his name was being whispered now with growing respect. John Gotti. Gotti was more than charisma. He understood the heartbeat of the streets. He drank with the soldiers, laughed with them, listened to their frustrations. He lived in their world, not above it. They saw him as a man who could restore the family's honor, a man who could make the Gambinos feared again instead of ridiculed. When he walked into a room, soldiers straightened their backs. When he spoke, they listened. And slowly, whispers about Castellano's weakness turned into whispers about Gotti's potential. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It grew like cracks in stone, invisible at first, then spreading until the whole structure began to tremble. Men who had once handed over their envelopes with respect now handed them over with clenched jaws. They began to question orders, delay obedience, and quietly test the waters of rebellion. The more Castellano retreated into his mansion, the louder the whispers became. He was distant. He was soft. He was finished. The indictments only made things worse. Castellano was facing federal charges that threatened to bury him in prison. Soldiers looked at him and saw not a protector but a liability. A boss under indictment brought heat to everyone. Every conversation risked surveillance. Every envelope risked exposure. To them, Castellano was radioactive. Staying loyal to him meant burning with him. And in the shadows, Gotti waited. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to call for rebellion. His very presence was enough. Soldiers gravitated toward him, drawn to his energy, his confidence, his sense of belonging. They saw in him the street don they craved, the leader who would fight beside them, not rule above them. Castellano's distance created a void. Gotti filled it. The FBI, always listening, always watching, noted the shift. They saw Castellano's authority fading, saw the admiration for Gotti rising. They knew the family was dividing, splintering into factions that could not hold together forever. To them, it was only a matter of time before whispers turned into bullets. Inside the White House, Castellano seemed oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind. He still believed money was enough. He still believed fear would keep his men in line. But fear without respect is fragile, and money without loyalty is worthless. He had become a boss in name only, commanding obedience on paper while losing hearts in reality. The soldiers mocked him in private. They said he was too busy with his mistress to care about their struggles. They said he ate better than kings while they risked prison for scraps. They said he had forgotten what it meant to be a gangster. And every joke, every whisper, every sneer chipped away at the last remnants of his authority. Betrayal, in the Mafia, rarely announces itself with words. It grows quietly, invisibly, until one day it explodes. Castellano didn't hear it yet, but the streets were already turning against him. His own men were weighing the risks, measuring their loyalties, calculating whether their futures were safer with him or without him. And at the center of those calculations stood John Gotti, smiling, waiting, building his power one handshake at a time. The White House Don still believed he was untouchable. But in the smoky backrooms of the city, the whispers had become a storm. And soon, that storm would break. The winter of 1985 brought with it more than cold winds. It brought the end of a man who, for decades, had been the bridge between the streets and the boss in the mansion. Aniello Della Croce, underboss of the Gambino family, the quiet general who held the loyalty of the blue-collar faction, was dying of cancer. For months his face had grown thinner, his cough harsher, his body weaker. The men who had once seen him as unshakable now watched helplessly as the disease consumed him. Even in his final days, he continued to sit with them at the Rave Night Social Club, listening, reassuring, steady as always. But everyone knew the truth. His time was almost over. When the news finally came that Della Croce had passed, the streets fell into mourning. Soldiers who had followed him for years felt as though the last thread holding them to Paul Castellano had been severed. To them, Della Croce was not just an underboss. He was a father, a protector, a reminder of the old ways. His death wasn't just a loss. It was an earthquake. Funerals in the Mafia are more than rituals of grief. They are displays of respect, gestures that show loyalty even in death. To attend is to honor not just the man, but everything he stood for. Della Croce's funeral was expected to be a gathering of soldiers, capos, and bosses, each one paying tribute to the man who had kept peace between factions when peace seemed impossible. The blue-collar faction waited for Castellano to arrive. They expected their boss to stand with them, shoulder to shoulder, in the final farewell to the man who had kept them loyal for so long. But Castellano never came. Instead, he remained inside his Staten Island fortress, behind iron gates and marble walls. His absence was explained in excuses, legal pressure, fear of surveillance, worries about being photographed with known criminals while facing indictments. To Paul, perhaps it was strategy. To his men, it was betrayal. Soldiers whispered in the pews as Della Croce's coffin was lowered, their voices carrying more anger than grief. How could the boss not come? How could he fail to honor the man who had held the family together, the man whose loyalty had allowed Castellano to rule it all? The absence was more than disrespect. It was an insult carved deep into their pride. It was the moment the whispers hardened into rage. For years, Castellano's distance had been tolerated because Della Croce was there to bridge the gap. His presence soothed the resentment, reminded men to be patient, to respect Gambino's last wishes. But now Della Croce was gone, and with him went the last shield protecting Castellano from the fury of the streets. In the rave night afterward, the bitterness was palpable. Soldiers sat in silence, faces hard, eyes filled with something darker than grief. They spoke quietly, but their words carried the weight of inevitability. Castellano had humiliated them. He had humiliated Della Croce. And in the Mafia, humiliation is a wound that festers until it demands blood. For John Gotti, Delacroix's death opened a door. He had been loyal to the underboss, learning from him, gaining respect from the men who loved him. Now, with Delacroix gone, those men needed someone new to follow. Someone who would honor their loyalty, share their lives, and restore their pride. Gotti didn't need to ask. The men were already turning toward him, drawn by his presence, his defiance, his promise to bring the family back to the streets. Castellano, sitting in his mansion, seemed oblivious to the storm he had unleashed. He told himself that skipping the funeral was caution, not disrespect. But perception is everything. And in the Mafia, perception becomes reality. To the soldiers, his absence confirmed what they had whispered for years, that he didn't care about them, that he looked down on them, that he wasn't their boss in spirit, only in name. The funeral that should have united the family in mourning had instead driven them further apart. Delacroix's coffin carried not only his body, but the last vestige of peace between factions. With him gone, the cracks became fractures, and the fractures became fault lines. The betrayal was no longer brewing in whispers. It was taking shape in shadows. The men of the street faction, humiliated and leaderless, no longer spoke of patience. They spoke of change. And the name they spoke most often was John Gotti. The White House Don still held the title of boss. He still had the mansion, the money, the unions, the power on paper. But titles mean nothing when respect is gone. And on that cold day in 1985, when he failed to appear at the funeral of Aniello Delacroix, Castellano lost the last of his respect. From that moment on, his fate was sealed. And though he couldn't hear it from behind his gates, the streets had already begun to write the ending to his story. The tension had reached its breaking point. For years, the Gambino family had lived with two truths. Paul Castellano was their boss, and John Gotti was the man rising in the shadows. Both truths could not survive together. By late 1985, whispers began to spread through the ranks like poison. Castellano was planning to have Gotti killed. Whether the rumor was true or not hardly mattered. In the Mafia, perception often outweighs reality. And to Gotti, the rumor felt like a death sentence unless he acted first. The origins of the rumor weren't hard to trace. Castellano had grown increasingly paranoid after the death of Aniello Delacroix. He saw the blue-collar faction, loyal to Delacroix, now gathering around Gotti, and it made him uneasy. To Castellano, Gotti was a street thug masquerading as a leader, reckless with his gambling, reckless with his swagger, reckless with his drug connections. Worse, Gotti had charisma. Soldiers gravitated toward him in ways they never had with Castellano. In the quiet of his Staten Island mansion, Castellano may have convinced himself that eliminating Gotti would solve his problems, restoring order and cementing his authority. But the streets heard it differently. Whispers in clubs and bars said the boss had marked Gotti for death. Men repeated the rumor in low voices, their tone half fearful, half excited. They had seen this story before. When a boss begins plotting against one of his own, the end is always bloody. The only question was who would strike first. For Gotti, hesitation wasn't an option. He had already grown tired of Castellano's rules, tired of a boss who never showed his face, tired of a Don who cared more about unions and contracts than the men who bled for him. Delacroix's funeral had been the last straw for many soldiers. Now, with rumors of his own impending execution, Gotti made his decision. If Castellano wanted him dead, then Castellano would die first. The choice was more than survival. It was ambition. Gotti understood something Castellano never could. The Mafia is built on presence, not distance. Soldiers wanted a leader they could touch, a leader who lived among them, who reminded them of the old days. Gotti was ready to be that leader. Killing Castellano wasn't just about avoiding death. It was about seizing the throne. Planning the hit was dangerous, almost suicidal. Castellano was still the official boss of the most powerful family in the country. Moving against him meant declaring war on the very system that held Cosa Nostra together. The Mafia Commission traditionally approved leadership changes, but Gotti wasn't waiting for permission. He would make his move without the commission, gambling that once Castellano was gone, the streets would rally behind him. It was a gamble soaked in risk, but Gotti had already decided. Better to strike bold than to wait quietly for his own execution. The days leading up to the decision were filled with tension. Gotti met with his closest allies, men who shared his frustrations and ambitions. They sat in back rooms, discussing plans in whispers, testing loyalty with every sentence. Betrayal could mean death before they even made their move. But one by one, they agreed. Castellano had lost the streets. His time was over. Meanwhile, inside the White House mansion, Castellano prepared for a meeting at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. He believed it would be routine, a chance to sit down with key men and resolve business disputes. He had no idea that Gotti's crew was already setting the trap. The irony was heavy. Castellano, so cautious, so obsessed with distance and safety, would be lured into one of the most public settings imaginable, a crowded Manhattan street. The streets buzzed with anticipation. Soldiers who had once kept their doubts to themselves now spoke openly of Gotti's rise. They admired his courage, his defiance, his willingness to take risks that Castellano would never take. Castellano had wealth, yes, but Gotti had momentum. And momentum in the Mafia is a deadly thing. For Gotti, the decision carried weight. He knew killing a sitting boss without commission approval was breaking one of the oldest rules in Cosa Nostra. But he also knew the rulebook was already broken. Castellano had broken it himself when he ignored his men, when he skipped Delacroce's funeral, when he ruled from behind iron gates. Respect was gone. Authority was gone. What remained was fear, and fear fades the moment someone is brave enough to challenge it. The plan was set in motion. Gotti would not pull the trigger himself. That was the role of his trusted men, the shooters who would wait in the cold December air outside Sparks. But the order was his, the responsibility his, the ambition his. As the night approached, the streets of New York seemed to hold their breath. Everyone knew something was coming. No one knew exactly when. Inside the White House, Castellano remained unaware. He still believed his title protected him, still believed that fear kept his men in line. He had no idea that the very soldiers he considered beneath him were already sharpening the knife for his throat. The betrayal wasn't whispered anymore. It was alive, moving in shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. Castellano thought he was planning the future of his empire. In reality, the future was already being written by men who had decided his time was over. And as the night of the Sparks meeting drew near, one truth became clear. Paul Castellano, the White House Don, was walking toward the end of his story. But whether he saw it coming or not, the streets had already made their choice. The final straw had been pulled. And now, there was no going back. The night was bitter cold, the kind of New York winter evening when the air itself feels sharp against your skin. Midtown Manhattan buzzed with holiday crowds, neon lights reflecting on wet pavement. But on December 16, 1985, all of that background noise faded into insignificance. On East 46th Street, outside Sparks Steakhouse, history was about to be rewritten in gunfire. Paul Castellano climbed into his black Lincoln with Thomas Bellotti at the wheel. To him, it was a routine trip into the city, another meeting over dinner. He believed his name, his wealth, his position as boss of the Gambino family made him untouchable. Surveillance cameras? Prosecutors? Yes, they were problems. But his own men? Never. Castellano's arrogance was his armor. What he didn't realize was that his armor was already full of holes. The car rolled into Midtown just after 6 in the evening. Traffic was thick, horns echoing between skyscrapers. Castellano sat in the back seat, wrapped in his coat, probably going over business matters in his head. Bellotti, ever loyal, focused on the road ahead. Neither of them knew that only blocks away, men were waiting. Men who had once sworn loyalty to Castellano, now sworn to his destruction. John Gotti and his crew had set the trap with precision. They chose Sparks because it was public, crowded, impossible for Castellano to suspect an ambush. To kill the boss in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, was madness by traditional Mafia standards. But Gotti understood the psychology of spectacle. This wasn't just a hit. It was a message. The age of the White House Don was over. The streets had taken back control. For shooters waited on the sidewalk, coats pulled tight, hands ready. They weren't nervous. They were focused. They had rehearsed this moment in their minds, knowing that once the shots were fired, there would be no turning back. To kill Castellano was to break one of the oldest rules of Cosa Nostra. It was a declaration of war against tradition itself. But they also knew that the soldiers were hungry for change, and once Castellano was gone, the tide would turn in their favor. The Lincoln slowed to a stop in front of Sparks. The holiday lights glowed warmly in the restaurant windows. Diners clinked glasses, oblivious to the storm about to erupt outside. Bellotti stepped out first, moving quickly to open Castellano's door. At that instant, the shooters closed in. The first shots cracked the air like firecrackers, loud, shocking against the hum of Manhattan traffic. Bellotti was hit instantly, collapsing to the ground as bullets tore into him. Castellano turned in confusion, his eyes wide, his mouth frozen in shock. For a split second, time seemed to pause. The boss of bosses standing in the glare of headlights, realizing too late that death had found him. Then the gunfire erupted again, ripping through him before he could take a step. Witnesses screamed, diving for cover. Cars skidded, horns blared, chaos spread in seconds. Castellano and Bellotti lay bleeding on the pavement, lifeless, their bodies crumpled in the cold night. The shooters melted into the crowd, disappearing before the police could even arrive. It was surgical, brutal, and final. The scene was chaos. By the time law enforcement arrived, crowds had gathered, gawking at the blood-stained pavement outside one of Manhattan's busiest restaurants. Flashbulbs from reporters lit up the street as detectives pushed back onlookers. The Don of the Gambino family, the man who thought himself untouchable, was lying dead in a pool of blood for the entire city to see. News spread like wildfire. Phones rang in social clubs, whispers raced through bars, soldiers shook their heads in disbelief. The White House Don, the man who ruled from behind gates and chandeliers, had been cut down in the open, like any other gangster. For some, it was shocking. For others, it was justice. For many, it was simply inevitable. John Gotti didn't need to announce what had happened. The entire Mafia world knew. The audacity of the hit, the precision of it, the spectacle, it all bore his signature. In a single night, he had toppled the boss and crowned himself the new king of the Gambino family. But the significance went deeper than just a change of leadership. Castellano's murder marked a turning point in the history of organized crime. For decades, bosses had ruled from the shadows, protected by respect and fear. Castellano believed that fortress still existed around him. But respect had vanished, and fear had shifted its loyalty. Gotti's strike at Sparks was more than assassination. It was the birth of a new era, one where the streets took precedence over boardrooms, where presence meant more than distance. Yet, even in his death, Castellano's story carried an air of tragic irony. He had built his life trying to rise above the filth of the streets, trying to turn the Mafia into a business empire. He lived in a mansion, spoke in business terms, and saw himself as more than a gangster. But in the end, he died like one, gunned down on the sidewalk, his body sprawled in the gutter. The Boardroom Don, reduced to another headline in the blood-soaked history of Cosa Nostra. In the days that followed, law enforcement scrambled to make sense of the hit. Some agents were stunned by the audacity. Others weren't surprised at all. They had been listening, watching, and they knew the cracks in Castellano's empire had been widening for years. They saw Gotti's rise coming. What they didn't know was how quickly the underworld would rally behind him after the shooting. For the Gambino family, the message was clear. Castellano's rule had ended the moment he skipped Delacroix's funeral. His authority had been crumbling long before Sparks. The bullets were simply the final punctuation. Soldiers who had once cursed Castellano's distance now celebrated Gotti's swagger. Respect had shifted overnight. But Castellano's death also sent shockwaves through the commission, the governing body of the Mafia. To kill a sitting boss without approval was an act of defiance that threatened the very fabric of the organization. If Gotti could do it, others might follow. The rules of tradition were crumbling, just as Castellano had feared. And in that crumbling, the Mafia itself edged closer to collapse. On that December night, 2 bodies lay on the cold pavement. But the fallout stretched far beyond Sparks' Steakhouse. Castellano's death marked the end of one kind of mafia and the beginning of another. The businessman Don was gone. In his place stood a street Don, one who would become both the most famous and the most reckless boss the mafia had ever seen. For the bystanders who saw it unfold, it was just another burst of violence in a city that had grown used to blood. For the Gambino family, it was a revolution. For law enforcement, it was proof that even the mightiest boss could fall. And for Paul Castellano, it was the ultimate irony. The man who thought he was too powerful, too wealthy, too insulated to be touched was left lying in the street, his empire stolen in a storm of gunfire. His life ended not by prosecutors or prison, but by betrayal delivered in the cold night air. The street had spoken, and its voice was louder than the Don in the White House had ever imagined. But the real question lingered in the smoke and blood outside Sparks. Had John Gotti truly seized power, or had he only signed his own death warrant with bullets that echoed far beyond Manhattan? The morning after the gunfire outside Sparks' Steakhouse, New York awoke to headlines screaming in black ink. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family, the so-called Howard Hughes of the mob, was dead, shot down in the street like a common thug. His body, slumped in the gutter of East 46th Street, had been photographed, documented, and plastered across the front pages of newspapers worldwide. The media frenzy was immediate. Reporters swarmed the crime scene within minutes of the shooting, cameras flashing, pens scribbling, phones buzzing. By dawn, every major paper from New York to Los Angeles, from London to Rome, carried the story on its front page. The images were stark. The lifeless figure of Castellano sprawled in the street, the chaos of flashing lights, the blood soaking into the frozen pavement. The boss of bosses, a man who had lived behind marble walls, was now immortalized in death, framed by neon lights and police tape. Television anchors spoke with breathless urgency. For years, the Mafia had been whispered about, shrouded in shadows. Now, the world was watching its most powerful leader gunned down in one of the busiest neighborhoods in Manhattan. Viewers who had never cared about organized crime before were suddenly glued to their screens, listening to commentators explain the significance of the assassination. It wasn't just another mob hit. It was a public execution staged in front of the entire city. The spectacle fascinated the public. For decades, mob bosses had been portrayed in movies, glamorized as figures of power and control. Castellano's death stripped away the glamour. The photographs didn't show a sophisticated businessman or a feared Don. They showed a man caught off guard, bleeding in the gutter, his wealth and power unable to save him. For many, it was shocking. For others, it confirmed what they had always believed. No one in the Mafia is untouchable. Law enforcement responded with a mix of outrage and grim satisfaction. Outrage, because the murder was so brazen, carried out in broad daylight, with no regard for bystanders. Satisfaction, because it proved what they had long suspected, that the Gambino family was tearing itself apart from the inside. Federal agents crowded into press conferences, vowing to crack down on organized crime, pointing to the assassination as proof that the Mafia's days of dominance were numbered. But behind closed doors, some admitted a quieter truth. The streets had done their work for them. Castellano, the man they had spent years trying to bring down through indictments and surveillance, had been removed by his own men. The public's fascination turned into frenzy. Magazine covers ran dramatic illustrations of Castellano's face next to headlines about betrayal, power, and blood. Radio hosts debated the meaning of the hit, speculating about who would take over, who had given the order, and what it meant for the future of New York. The name John Gotti began to surface, whispered at first, then spoken openly. Reporters described him as the charismatic figure waiting in the wings, the street Don ready to step into Castellano's shoes. In Italy, where Cosa Nostra had its roots, newspapers carried the story with a mix of awe and inevitability. To them, it was proof that the American Mafia, for all its wealth and polish, was no different from the blood feuds in Sicily. In London, headlines compared Castellano's fall to the collapse of empires. In Rome, commentators described it as a modern Caesar being cut down by his own senators. Around the world, people who had never heard of Castellano before now knew his name, forever tied to the steakhouse where his life ended in a hail of bullets. The Gambino family itself reacted in shock and silence. Soldiers, capos, associates, they all understood the significance. To kill a boss without the commission's blessing was heresy. But to see Castellano dead in the street made one thing clear: the rules had changed. Respect, tradition, the old ways, they had all been blown apart with the gunfire on East 46th Street. For some, it was terrifying. For others, it was liberating. Castellano's reign of distance and detachment was over. The streets belonged to the soldiers again. Families of law-abiding New Yorkers reacted with a different kind of fear. To them, the assassination wasn't about mafia politics. It was about chaos spilling into their lives. If mob bosses could be murdered in crowded Midtown, what did that mean for the safety of ordinary people? Parents pulled their children closer, commuters glanced nervously at strangers, business owners worried about being caught in the crossfire. Castellano's death reminded everyone that the mafia wasn't just a story in the newspapers. It was a violent force that lived among them. The funeral, when it came, was a quieter affair. Unlike the grand send-offs of old-school bosses, Castellano's burial was subdued, shadowed by the scandal of his assassination and the humiliation of his absence at Delacroix's funeral only weeks before. Few soldiers paid respects. Many stayed away altogether, unwilling to be seen showing loyalty to a man already erased by the streets. In death, Castellano suffered the ultimate mafia punishment, not just murder, but isolation. Meanwhile, John Gotti's name began to rise above the noise. Newspapers described him as the man most likely behind the hit, though he denied involvement. Reporters, drawn to his swagger and style, began to call him the Dapper Don. Photographs of him smiling in silk suits soon replaced images of Castellano's corpse on front pages. To the public, the shift was intoxicating. One Don had fallen, another had risen, and they were watching it all unfold in real time. The commission, the governing body of the mafia, faced a dilemma. Castellano's murder was a violation of everything they stood for. But punishing Gotti was easier said than done. The Gambino family, flush with soldiers loyal to the street, rallied behind him. Castellano had ruled with contracts and distance. Gotti ruled with presence and charisma. The soldiers had already made their choice. The commission could do little but accept the new order. The world's reaction revealed the paradox of Castellano's reign. For years, he had tried to transform the mafia into a corporation, to replace fear with numbers, to rule as a businessman rather than a gangster. But his death proved that the mafia was not a corporation. It was a brotherhood bound by blood, loyalty, and presence. Castellano had forgotten that. The streets had not. As the headlines circled the globe, one truth cut through every photograph, every article, every broadcast. Paul Castellano, the man who believed himself untouchable, had been touched in the most brutal way. His name, once spoken with respect in quiet rooms, was now spoken in past tense, attached forever to the steakhouse where his reign ended. And as the media frenzy reached its peak, as the world debated the meaning of his death, the real story was already shifting. John Gotti was stepping into the light, smiling, confident, ready to shape the mafia into something louder, flashier, and more dangerous than ever before. The world mourned, gawked, speculated, and sensationalized. But in the end, Castellano's death was not the story. It was the prologue to another. And in that silence between the headlines, in the space left by his fall, a single question lingered. Had the mafia gained a new leader, or had it just inherited its most reckless downfall yet? The night Paul Castellano bled out on the cold pavement of East 46th Street, a crown was torn from his head. In the mafia, power doesn't vanish when a man dies. It moves, it shifts, it is claimed. And even before the blood outside Sparks' Steakhouse had dried, the streets already knew who the next crown would fit. John Gotti had stepped out from the shadows and into history. The Gotti era had begun. For the soldiers of the Gambino family, Castellano's reign had ended not just in blood, but in relief. For years they had endured a boss who lived behind gates and chandeliers, who treated them like employees instead of brothers, who scolded them for dealing drugs while he lined his pockets with millions. They resented his distance, his arrogance, his detachment. When he died, no one shed tears in the social clubs. Instead, they leaned back in their chairs, exhaled smoke, and muttered words that carried a sense of release. It's over. Gotti moved quickly. Power in the Mafia is like an open flame. If you don't grasp it immediately, it flickers out or burns someone else's hand. He called meetings, gathered allies, and assured the soldiers that the days of the White House dawn were gone. No more business done from a marble fortress. No more boss too distant to understand the streets. With Gotti, they would have a leader who walked among them, laughed with them, drank with them. He was one of their own. And that simple truth gave him something Castellano never had: love. The media, always hungry for a face to match the blood-soaked headlines, latched onto Gotti with fascination. Where Castellano had hidden in his mansion, avoiding cameras and reporters, Gotti embraced the spotlight. He wore $1,000 suits, smiled for photographers, and strutted out of courtrooms as if the charges against him were mere inconveniences. The press called him the Dapper Don, a gangster with style, a criminal who seemed untouchable. Crowds outside courthouses cheered for him. Women swooned over his charm. To the public, he was a character straight out of a Hollywood script. But beneath the swagger was calculation. Gotti knew that his charisma was more than vanity. It was armor. By cultivating a public image, by becoming larger than life, he made himself harder to ignore, harder to betray. He used the media like Castellano had used unions and construction contracts. Where Castellano had sought legitimacy through business, Gotti sought it through fame. Different tools, same purpose: to make the Gambino name untouchable. For law enforcement, however, Castellano's assassination was both a gift and a challenge. The gift was obvious. The Mafia had proven once again that it could destroy itself from within. The challenge was Gotti. He wasn't a quiet, calculating boss who could be tracked through paperwork and surveillance. He was loud, flamboyant, reckless. He invited attention instead of avoiding it. That made him easier to watch, but harder to pin down. Juries, swayed by his charm and by fear of Mafia retaliation, acquitted him time and time again. Each victory made his legend grow. Inside the Gambino family, Gotti cemented his power by rewarding loyalty and punishing betrayal. Soldiers who had sided with Castellano were pushed aside, their influence stripped away. Those who had backed Gotti from the start were elevated, given control over lucrative rackets. Fear kept the disloyal quiet. Admiration kept the loyal close. Unlike Castellano, who ruled with distance, Gotti ruled with presence. His very arrival at the Rave Night Social Club was enough to electrify the room. Soldiers leaned in to hear his words, to bask in his approval. He was not a ghost behind iron gates. He was flesh and blood, right there with them. Yet Gotti's rise was not without danger. The commission had rules, and Castellano's murder had broken one of the oldest. You do not kill a boss without approval. By taking out Castellano without consent, Gotti had challenged not just one man, but the entire structure of Cosa Nostra. Other families looked at him with suspicion, even anger. To some, he was a hero who had rid them of a boss who had grown too arrogant. To others, he was a reckless thug whose ambition threatened the stability of them all. The commission debated retaliation, but Gotti's support within his own family was too strong. To move against him would be suicide. In the neighborhoods, however, his popularity was undeniable. Children pointed at him on the street, calling him a movie star. Old-timers in clubs spoke of him with respect. He gave money freely, played the role of benefactor, making himself not just feared but admired. Castellano had been obeyed out of obligation. Gotti was followed out of love. And in the Mafia, love is a rare and dangerous thing. Still, there were those who watched with unease. Castellano's murder had sent a shockwave through the underworld, a reminder that even the mightiest boss could be brought down by betrayal. If Castellano could be gunned down in the street, so could Gotti. Power in the Mafia is never permanent. It is borrowed, never owned. And every borrowed crown comes with the promise of eventual payment. But in 1986, with Castellano barely cold in the ground, Gotti stood at the peak of his power. He had done the unthinkable, and he had survived. He had seized the Gambino family, the largest mafia family in America, and bent it to his will. The newspapers crowned him the new king, and for once, the streets agreed. For Castellano, the White House Don, his reign had ended in humiliation. His fortress had not saved him. His rules had not protected him. His empire had collapsed in the space of a few gunshots on a crowded street. For Gotti, it was only the beginning. And though he would one day pay the price for his audacity, in those first days of power, he seemed unstoppable. Proof that in the Mafia, boldness can rewrite destiny, and betrayal can crown a new king. But the question lingered, whispered even by those who cheered his rise. Had Gotti truly secured the throne, or had he simply painted a target on his back larger than any Don before him? The last image the world remembers of Paul Castellano is not of the wealthy businessman in his tailored suits, not of the Don presiding over his marble dining table, not of the figure who ruled the Gambino family with contracts and caution. It is of a body lying on the cold Manhattan pavement, lifeless, sprawled outside a steakhouse as holiday lights twinkled in the background. A man who believed himself untouchable ended like so many of his kind had before, betrayed, silenced, and left to bleed in the street. That is the legacy of the White House Don. For years, Castellano had tried to shape the Mafia into something different. He wasn't interested in the street corner dice games or the smoky backroom card tables that defined the old ways. He saw himself as a visionary, someone who could turn Cosa Nostra into a corporation. Construction rackets became boardroom deals. Union manipulation looked like corporate negotiations. Price fixing in the meat industry resembled business strategy. To Castellano, this wasn't crime, it was evolution. He imagined the Mafia growing so sophisticated that it would be indistinguishable from legitimate business, untouchable by the crude tactics of law enforcement. But that vision came with a cost. In turning the Mafia into a corporation, Castellano forgot what had built it in the first place. It wasn't contracts or companies. It was loyalty, blood, and respect earned face-to-face. The men who stood on street corners, who risked prison with every envelope collected, wanted a leader who understood them. Castellano gave them a landlord instead. He ruled from a distance, his iron gates and chandeliers becoming symbols not of power, but of arrogance. He mistook fear for loyalty, silence for respect. And in the Mafia, that mistake is fatal. When he banned his men from drug trafficking, he believed he was protecting them. To him, heroin was a plague that would destroy the family from the inside out. But to the soldiers, it was money, fast, easy, life-changing money. By cutting them off, he didn't save them. He alienated them. They whispered that their boss didn't care about their survival, only about his reputation. Each indictment tied to heroin tightened the noose around their necks, while Castellano remained untouched in his mansion. The resentment festered like an open wound. Then came the tapes. Hidden FBI bugs inside his White House captured not just business, but intimacy. His private affair with the maid, his crude words, his casual discussions of hits. They all stripped away the image he had worked so hard to create. Respect eroded faster than cement could dry. A Don who prided himself on discipline was exposed as distracted, hypocritical, vulnerable. His family life, once considered sacred, became ammunition for whispers of disloyalty and disgust. By the time Aniello Della Croce died, Castellano's reign was already fragile. Della Croce had been the bridge, the one man holding the street faction together, keeping their loyalty tethered to Castellano out of respect for tradition. When Della Croce was gone and Castellano skipped his funeral, the final thread snapped. To the soldiers, it wasn't just disrespect. It was betrayal. A boss who would not honor his underboss in death was no boss worth honoring in life. From that moment, Castellano's downfall was written. The betrayal came not from the government, but from within. John Gotti, the brash street figure who embodied everything Castellano wasn't, stepped into the void. Charismatic, present, fearless, Gotti was the mirror opposite of the White House Don. Where Castellano had withdrawn into isolation, Gotti embraced the streets. Where Castellano sought legitimacy, Gotti sought fame. The soldiers, tired of distance, chose swagger. They chose the man who made them feel seen. The hit outside Sparks Steakhouse was more than an execution. It was a rejection of everything Castellano had stood for. His vision of a corporate mafia died with him on that sidewalk. The bullets weren't just aimed at a man. They were aimed at an idea, the notion that the mafia could be sanitized, rebranded, disguised as legitimate. The streets had spoken, and their message was clear. The mafia was built in blood, and blood would always rule it. And yet, Castellano's legacy is complicated. His rackets in construction, unions, and concrete reshaped New York's skyline. His control over industries funneled millions into mafia coffers in ways that law enforcement struggled to detect. He was a pioneer in white-collar crime, decades ahead of his time in recognizing that power came not from back alleys, but from boardrooms. In that sense, he wasn't wrong. But in forgetting his roots, in neglecting the very soldiers who made the Gambino family what it was, he undermined his own foundation. He built a skyscraper on quicksand. History doesn't remember Castellano as a genius or a visionary. It remembers him as a cautionary tale, a man who tried to change the mafia, but who never understood that change cannot come without respect. His empire collapsed not because of federal indictments, not because of the RICO Act, but because the men beneath him no longer believed in him. When soldiers stop believing, betrayal is inevitable. And betrayal, in the mafia, is always delivered with bullets. His story ends with irony. The Don who thought himself above the streets, who imagined himself a CEO rather than a gangster, was killed in the most public, street-level way possible. No trial, no exile, no quiet retirement, just a flurry of gunshots on a Manhattan sidewalk. His fall became a spectacle, splashed across newspapers worldwide, his corpse immortalized in photographs that stripped him of all dignity. The White House on Staten Island still stands, but it is no longer a fortress. It is a reminder. Walls cannot protect a man who loses the loyalty of those outside them. Chandeliers and marble cannot replace respect. The empire Castellano built turned to dust the moment his men decided they were better off without him. What remains is a legacy of contradiction. He was brilliant, yet blind. Powerful, yet fragile. A man who dreamed of legitimacy, but died like a gangster. His story is not one of triumph, but of warning. In Cosa Nostra, distance is death. The mafia has always been about presence, about looking a man in the eye, about standing shoulder to shoulder, about sharing in risk and reward. Castellano tried to replace that with contracts, corporations, and distance. And for that, the soldiers turned their backs on him. On that December night in 1985, when Paul Castellano fell to the sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse, the blood in the street was more than his own. It was the death of his vision, the shattering of an idea that the mafia could be anything other than what it was born to be. And as the echoes of gunfire faded into the cold Manhattan air, the story of the White House dawn closed on a single, haunting truth. You can try to build the mafia into a corporation, but if you forget its soul, the streets will always remind you. Through betrayal, through violence, through the finality of bullets in the dark.